What do a 70-year-old king and a 15-year-old bride have in common? Power, legacy, and absolutely nothing else. Across centuries and continents, royal families have sealed empires with wedding rings and the age gaps. Jaw-dropping, uncomfortable, strangely consistent. This isn't about love. It's about lineage, politics, control. 30 royal marriages, each more unsettling than the last. Some built kingdoms, others ended in scandal. All of them ask the same question. When does tradition stop being noble and start being grotesque? Welcome to 30 royal marriages with the largest age gaps. History's most uncomfortable love stories. Before we dive in, if you love long-form mysteries, strange histories, and stories that make you uncomfortable in the best way, hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep digging where history gets weird. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Better yet, tell us what time it is where you are right now. Midnight? 3 a.m.? Are you supposed to be asleep or working? Either way, you're here now. And this is where it gets strange. Władysław II, Jagiełło and Sophia of Halszany. There's a certain kind of silence that lingers in portraits. A lacquered stillness, regal, timeless, reverent. But sometimes, if you look too long, the silence stops feeling like stillness and starts feeling like a question no one wants to answer. In one such painting, Władysław to Jagiełło stares out as the aging king of 1,000 battles, the crowned ruler of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. A man born in the 1,350 seconds, moulded by pagan rites, Christian conversions and endless wars. His eyes are those of a man who has seen too much and yet married too young, just not for himself. Enter Sophia of Halszany. Her story doesn't begin with power. It begins in the provincial dust of what is now Belarus. A noblewoman of the Geminid line, distant but legitimate, useful but unthreatening. She was possibly 15, maybe a year younger. She was not famous, she was not loud, and she was not ready. When Władysław married her, he was already over 70. That's not a typo. It's not even rare, by medieval standards. But it is chilling. Not because it was criminal, everything about this union was technically lawful, blessed, canonized, and politically strategic, but because it was precisely that. Everything about it made sense, except the humans involved. By the early 15th century, Jagiełło had already buried 2 wives and outlived most of his political enemies. But there was one problem he couldn't outlive: succession. Poland needed an heir. Jagiełło needed a womb. Sophia, meanwhile, needed nothing, except perhaps to avoid offending powerful men. She was picked for her beauty, yes, but more importantly, her obscurity. She had no dynasty to back her, no brothers with swords, no cousins whispering treason, just a name and a uterus. And so, in 1422, the old king and the teenage girl were Wednesday. The wedding itself was the kind of ornate pageantry where everyone smiled too much and drank too fast. And under the weight of centuries, we've tried to make it look like strategy. But somewhere in those chambers, behind the veil of court records and ceremonial tapestries, a girl grew up in real time while her husband aged toward legend. It worked, politically. Sophia gave birth to 4 children, 2 of whom survived. Most importantly, she delivered Władysław III heir to the throne. A miracle, some said. Proof that the old lion still had teeth. But underneath that national relief was a far quieter horror. The miracle was expected. The miracle was required. And so, Sophia, barely out of adolescence, became the mother of a kingdom before she had fully become a woman. Was there love? Maybe. Sophia reportedly mourned her husband deeply after his death in 1434. But grief is complicated. It is entirely possible to mourn a man who was kind to you and still be haunted by the way you were never allowed to be a child. She ruled as Queen Dowager with some dignity. She even involved herself in her son's political futures. But the role she played, the one history remembers her for, was primarily biological. A bridge between generations. A vessel for continuity. A girl married to a man old enough to be her grandfather, because the kingdom had a throne that needed warming and a crown that needed passing. And the irony? Jagiełło, for all his wisdom and foresight, may have started a chain reaction of dynastic instability. His sons would die young. His grandson Sigismund would inherit a throne increasingly fractured by succession crises. The Jagiełłonian dynasty expanded, yes, but never quite stabilized. In a way, it mirrored the marriage that started it all. Necessary, momentous, and quietly tragic. The silence in those portraits still lingers. Jagiełło's eyes stare out from beneath a heavy crown, while Sophia's youthful face looks just slightly off-center, as though someone painted her in and wasn't quite sure where she belonged. She outlived him by over 30 years, but never really outlived the role they cast her in. Even in death, she's remembered not for what she did, but for who she gave birth to. History calls it pragmatism. Modernity calls it disturbing. The throne, of course, never says a word. And speaking of silence, there's another portrait that raises similar questions. It features a 6-year-old bride, a grown king, and a contract so politically urgent that no one seemed to flinch when the child was led to the altar. Richard II of England and Isabella of Valois. History loves its ironies, and few are quite as perversely elegant as a king deposed by his own cousin, remembered not for his governance or his wars, but for the strangely formal marriage to a child bride. Richard II was 29 years old when he married Isabella of Valois. She was 6, not 16, 6. And yet, the chroniclers were largely unbothered. It was 1396. England and France were locked in what was, by then, just the middle chapters of the 100 Years' War, a military conflict so long and dysfunctional it began to resemble family therapy with swords. Peace was the priority, or at least, a politically viable ceasefire. And in that grim calculus, nothing said diplomacy quite like a royal child handed off like a treaty signature with pigtails. Isabella was the daughter of Charles VI of France, a king who, depending on the month, either dressed like a monarch or believed he was made of glass. Yes, that, Charles VI, the mad king of France. So negotiations with his court were less about statecraft and more about managing whichever delusion was in fashion that week. Still, both sides wanted peace, and peace needed collateral. Enter Isabella. She was bright, charming, and if we take the sources at face value, unusually composed for her age. But then, children in royal courts were often trained to smile through almost anything. The union was agreed upon quickly. There would be no consummation, not until she was older, they insisted. Instead, she would be treated with honour, as a guest of the English crown, growing up in splendour under Richard's guardianship until she reached the legal age of maturity. That sounds noble on paper, except that behind the gilded veneer was a deeply transactional arrangement where a child became the human placeholder for a geopolitical armistice. The wedding itself was held in Calais. Think, jewelled gowns, gold-leafed pageantry, a bishop trying not to wince as he read vows to a girl who barely reached his knee. Richard reportedly presented Isabella with jewels, silks, and a dowry fit for an empress. Witnesses claimed he treated her with kindness, like a father might. And yet, he wasn't her father. He was her husband. A fact that remains legally true, however symbolic the marriage was meant to be. The most surreal part, Isabella apparently liked Richard, or at least she liked the idea of him. She reportedly cried for days after learning of his eventual downfall. Whether this was affection or fear is anyone's guess, but in the eyes of many courtiers, the marriage had worked. France had its peace, England had its queen, and Richard had temporarily neutralized his critics. Temporarily, because, of course, none of it lasted. 2 years after the wedding, Richard was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, his cousin, his rival, his inevitable successor. The deposition was bloodless, bureaucratic, and absolute. Richard was quietly escorted into confinement and, depending on which version of the story you believe, never came out again. His fate remains one of England's great historical ambiguities. Was he starved? Murdered? Left to rot? The official story says death, the unofficial ones say exile, but all of them agree on one thing: his queen was left behind. At 8 years old, Isabella was a widow, or at least a diplomatic inconvenience. Henry IV offered her a second marriage, to his son, the future Henry V. She refused. Or rather, her French relatives refused on her behalf. She was returned to France, where she eventually married Charles, Duke of Orleans, a man only about a decade older, relatively close in age. A comfort, perhaps, or a correction. She died young, at 19, after a difficult childbirth. Her second husband would spend most of his life in English captivity, a tragic figure in his own right. Their daughter, Jeanne, would go on to marry into the House of Alençon and disappear into the folds of history like so many royal women whose lives were measured by whose bloodlines they extended. Isabella's legacy? Mostly ceremonial. A queen without a reign, a wife without a marriage, a pawn without her board. She remains a symbol of royal fragility and how even the most glittering crowns can hide the quiet sorrows of childhood interrupted. There are no heroic paintings of Isabella, no famous speeches, no towering monuments, just documents, records, mentions. Enough to know she was there silent, obedient, draped in silks too heavy for her shoulders. Some historians insist that by the standards of the time, her story wasn't unusual, that children were often used as diplomatic bridges, and they're right, but that's not the defense they think it island. Because if anything, Isabella's story reminds us just how much royal power depended on the absence of consent, on the art of pretending that politics was parenting, and that treaties were toys. Richard, for all his flaws, might have been the more tragic of the two. A king who mistook symbolism for strength, who married peace but couldn't hold on to power. But Isabella? She was peace incarnate, the living embodiment of a truce too fragile to last, and when it crumbled, so did her place in the kingdom that once called her queen. And if you're wondering whether monarchs ever learned to stop measuring treaties by the inches of their brides' shoes, the answer, as usual, lies in the next throne room, where a Dutch king decided that the solution to a midlife crisis was a teenage wife and a royal nursery on standby. 2 marriages in, and if you're already feeling the uneasy rhythm of history repeating itself, good. That means you're paying attention. Quick pause before we move on. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. These aren't stories you'll find in your average history book, and we go deep every time. Also, where are you listening from? What country, what city, and what time is it right now? Are you watching this in broad daylight or somewhere around 2:47 a.m., wrapped in a blanket, wondering how we got here? Either way, buckle up. The next one's worse. King William III of the Netherlands and Queen Emma. There's a certain look that shows up in royal portraits painted toward the end of a monarch's life, an expression forged in the furnace of too many state dinners, too many military campaigns, and far too many funerals. In the case of King William III of the Netherlands, the look wasn't just weary, it was apocalyptic. By the time he married Emma of Waldeck and Pyrmont in 1879, William was 61. Emma, on the other hand, was a fresh-faced 20. That's a 41-year gap, if you're counting. And trust us, everyone at court was counting. But before we get to the wedding bells and well-rehearsed curtsies, let's set the scene. William III wasn't exactly riding a wave of public affection when he proposed to Emma. His first wife, Sophie of Württemberg, had died after a long, strained marriage, marked by both political tension and personal Cold War. Their relationship had been so unpleasant that for much of their marriage, they lived in separate palaces. Sophie focused on literature and quiet diplomacy. William focused on not being home. By the time Sophie passed away in 1877, William had gained a reputation as a volatile and difficult ruler. He had alienated most of his ministers, lost the respect of much of the Dutch political class, and earned the nickname King Gorilla for his temper. He was not a man known for subtlety, or tact, or restraint, which made his next move all the more curious. Instead of retiring into monarchical dotage with a few ceremonial appearances and some modest garden parties, William decided to remarry. And not just remarry, but remarry young. Emma was German, minor nobility, respectable, modest, and carefully educated. The seventh daughter of a prince whose domain was small enough to misplace on a map, she was ideal dynastic material. Importantly, she came with no political baggage, no ambitious uncles, and no emotional history to complicate things. Just youth, beauty, and an apparent willingness to marry a man who could have been her grandfather. The marriage took place in Irolsen, in the Kingdom of Prussia, in what must have been a display of pageantry so stiff it nearly cracked under its own symbolism. But beyond the uncomfortable arithmetic of their ages, the union had a specific and desperate purpose. William needed an heir. His sons from his first marriage had died. The future of the House of Orange was now in doubt. If he died without issue, the Dutch crown would have to pass sideways, or worse, outside the kingdom entirely. What he needed was a womb. What Emma provided was one of the last functioning dynastic incubators on the continent. 1 year into the marriage, Emma gave birth to a daughter, Wilhelmina. And that changed everything. For William, the birth of Wilhelmina was a brief reprieve from dynastic anxiety, but it didn't make him any more likable. He continued ruling with erratic intensity, and by the early 1882, his health began to fail. The portrait of the aging king began to deepen into caricature, a man clinging to his throne while the court prepared for what felt like a slow, silent coup. In 1890, he finally died. His daughter was 10, and Emma, barely out of her 20s, became the regent of the Netherlands. And here's the twist no one saw coming. She was good at it. Emma ruled as regent for 8 years, guiding the country through the transition with discipline, grace, and surprising political skill. She consulted widely, modernized aspects of the monarchy's public image, and ensured that Wilhelmina would inherit not just a throne, but a functional one. In other words, the 20-year-old girl who'd married a temperamental old king turned out to be the adult in the room all along. Historians still debate whether Emma loved William. That question may miss the point. What we can say is that she understood him perhaps better than anyone else in his life, and whether out of survival, conviction, or a deeper emotional bond, she played the part history assigned her with eerie precision. But the image persists. William, towering and dishevelled, barking orders in a crumbling palace, and Emma, poised, diplomatic, already preparing for the moment she'd have to stand alone. It's the kind of reversal that gives dynasties their myths, the old king reaching back toward youth, and the young queen quietly stepping forward into power. And Wilhelmina? She would go on to become one of the longest reigning monarchs in Dutch history, steadfast during 2 world wars, adored by her people, and remembered for her unshakable resolve. All of which, somehow, emerged from a marriage that on paper looked more like a parody of royal desperation than a foundation for national stability. But that's monarchy for you. It's not about the romance, it's about the calculus. And sometimes the equation balances in the most unexpected ways. Of course, not every royal couple makes it to legacy status. Sometimes the throne isn't stable. Sometimes the gap is too wide. And sometimes the bride barely knows the language, or the man waiting at the altar. Which brings us to a widowed king in his 50s and a teenage girl imported from across the sea who was asked to be both a queen and a decoration. King Henry I of England and Adeliza of Louvain. By the time King Henry I decided to marry again, he wasn't exactly in a romantic phase of life. He was 53 years old, had outlived his wife, his only legitimate son, and several decades worth of enemies. He had also fathered more illegitimate children than most medieval kings would publicly acknowledge, somewhere north of 20. You could say he was experienced, or just profoundly prolific. But in 1121, with the English throne wobbling in the aftermath of personal tragedy, Henry realized he had one job left to do: marry a young woman, fast, and preferably one with a functional reproductive system and no political complications. Enter Adeliza of Louvain, 18 years old, Belgian nobility, fluent in diplomacy, embroidery, and silence. She was renowned for her beauty. Some even called her the Fair Maid of Brabant. But more importantly, she came with no ex-husbands, no children, and no immediate expectations. An ideal candidate for what the court politely referred to as the renewal of the royal line. So, of course, they were married almost immediately. Their union was celebrated with the usual medieval flair: feasts, alliances, Latin prayers, and solemn nods from bishops pretending not to do math in their heads. Henry was over 35 years her senior, but no one flinched, or at least, no one flinched in public. Because behind the thick stone walls of the court, everyone knew what this was: a reproductive mission wrapped in royal ceremony. The urgency made sense. The death of Henry's son, William Adelin, in the White Ship disaster of 1120, had plunged England into a quiet panic. Without a male heir, the succession was murky at best and catastrophic at worst. His daughter Matilda had been designated his successor, but medieval England wasn't exactly progressive when it came to women holding power. So Henry's plan was simple: remarry, conceive a son, and sleep better at night. Only, things didn't go according to plan. Adeliza, despite being young and healthy and presumably cooperative, bore no children, not one. Over the course of their nearly 15-year marriage, there were no pregnancies recorded, no hopeful rumors, no failed announcements, just silence. Which, in a royal context, is its own kind of scandal. There are theories, of course. Some say Henry had simply aged out of the role. Others suggest health issues, stress, or divine punishment. But none of those theories change the public reality. Adeliza, for all her grace and piety, had failed in the only task the monarchy had given her. And yet, what's remarkable is how she handled it. Rather than fading into obscurity or retreating into private despair, Adeliza leaned into her role as queen in a different way. She became a patron of the arts, a generous supporter of churches and monasteries. A public presence who travelled with Henry and stood beside him at court ceremonies, not as a mother, but as an emblem of refinement and dignity. Even without heirs, she upheld the image of stability. Some historians have suggested that their marriage was surprisingly affectionate, despite the lack of children. There's little direct evidence of intimacy, but the lack of scandal surrounding Adeliza's queenship is telling. In a court that thrived on rumour, she was strangely unrumoured, which, in royal terms, is practically sainthood. Henry died in 1135, leaving England with the very crisis he'd hoped to avoid: a contested throne, a power-hungry aristocracy, and a civil war that would last nearly 2 decades. Adeliza, now widowed and still in her early 30s, moved to a convent for a time, but she didn't stay there. Instead, she remarried. And here's where things take a strange turn. Adeliza's second husband was William d'Aubigny, a nobleman more age-appropriate, politically active, and notably not a king. Together, they had at least 7 children, which sparked a very awkward question in certain circles. Had the problem really been with her first husband after all? Her fertility, it seemed, had been fully functional the whole time. The throne, unfortunately, had simply run out of time. Adeliza spent her later years largely away from court, dividing her time between religious patronage and family affairs. She died in 1151, having lived through the reigns of 2 kings, a queen, and enough civil unrest to fuel a dozen Game of Thrones spin-offs. Her life was not one of fiery drama or poetic rebellion. It was something stranger, a life of almosts. Almost queen mother, almost progenitor of a dynasty, almost remembered. And that's the uncomfortable footnote to her story. She did everything right. She was beautiful, obedient, pious, politically neutral. She didn't stir controversy. She didn't overstep. She played her part. But history doesn't reward performance, it rewards results. No heir, no legacy, no throne. Still, her presence lingered. Her influence endured in the architecture she sponsored, the churches she funded, the dignified image she carved out in an era that saw most women as either wives or wombs. She didn't give the king what he wanted, but she gave the crown what it needed, the illusion of stability, if only for a while. And when the crown needed another illusion, it turned once again to the age-old solution. Find a very old king and a very young bride, stage another royal miracle, and pray that the math doesn't make anyone squirm. Which brings us to a marriage even more mathematically unsettling, where the king was closer to the grave than the cradle, and the bride was young enough to be mistaken for his granddaughter. King Edward I of England and Margaret of France. By the time King Edward I walked down the aisle for the second time, he had already buried a wife, a few children, and an entire generation of military enemies. The man was pushing 60, famously battle-hardened, and still built like the side of a cathedral. His nickname Longshanks came not from court poets, but from the sheer size of his legs. He was not a romantic figure. He was a fortress in boots. And yet, in 1299, he decided to marry again. Enter Margaret of France, daughter of Philip III, young, gracious, politically convenient, and approximately 20 years old. The age gap? Around 40 years. The first reaction from Europe's courts was diplomatic confusion, followed by the awkward realization that yes, Edward was quite serious about it. This was no passing affair or symbolic union. Edward wanted a new wife, new heirs, and a fresh chance at consolidating power in the twilight of his reign. And Margaret? Well, Margaret had options. But none of them were as immediate, wealthy, or in need of a fertile alliance as the aging King of England. Their marriage wasn't impulsive. It was the result of months of negotiations, mostly over dowry, land claims, and one rather stubborn elephant, yes, an actual elephant, gifted to Edward by the King of France, and later kept in the Tower of London, where it reportedly refused to eat anything but chicken. But behind the formal treaties and animal diplomacy was a rather pragmatic fear. Edward needed sons. His surviving heir from his first marriage, the future Edward II, was underwhelming. Sensitive, delicate, not what you'd call conquest material. In other words, a backup plan was prudent. So the wedding went ahead. Margaret was said to be shy but charming. She spoke little English at first and even less of Edward's brand of hardened sarcasm. But she adapted quickly, winning over courtiers with a quiet dignity and reportedly a fondness for poetry. More importantly, she performed her expected role gracefully, publicly, and soon productively. In 1301, just 2 years into the marriage, she gave birth to a son, Thomas of Brotherton. 2 years later, another son, Edmund of Woodstock. Edward, now in his 60s, was suddenly the father of toddlers, which sounds exhausting for most retirees, but Edward took it as divine proof that he still had one foot in the future. For Margaret, motherhood was both a promotion and a burden. She was still a new queen in a foreign court, barely out of her teens, raising infants under the shadow of a king who had lived through 5 popes, 3 crusades, and more border wars than most medieval generals could name. Her role wasn't just about producing heirs, it was about producing calm. Because by this point, Edward was no longer the dashing warrior of legend. He was tired, brutal when necessary, paranoid, some said. He micromanaged his armies, obsessed over his tax records, and routinely threatened anyone who so much as blinked at Wales or Scotland. His enemies called him iron-hearted. His allies just hoped he didn't look their direction on a bad day. And Margaret? Margaret endured him. She didn't try to reform him. She didn't challenge him. She played the long game, smiling at ceremonies, baptizing sons, and ensuring that no one forgot the crown still had youth in its bloodline. She even became something of a moderating presence, using her influence to temper his punishments and soften his dealings with courtiers. Some chroniclers even claimed Edward mellowed slightly in her company, which, for a man who once ordered the flaying of a traitor's body in public, is saying something. But the reprieve was brief. In 1307, while on campaign in Scotland again, Edward died, 70 years old, still in armour, still issuing orders. He had reportedly demanded that his bones be carried into battle if he died, just so he could keep intimidating the Scots from beyond the grave. No one took him up on that offer. Margaret, now widowed at around 27, found herself at a familiar crossroads, young, royal, and strategically valuable. But this time, she chose a quieter path. She didn't remarry. She focused on raising her sons, managing her estates, and supporting her stepson Edward II's troubled reign from the political sidelines. She died in 1318, in her mid-40s, having navigated one of the most surreal marital arrangements in English history, with composure, caution, and quiet endurance. Her story isn't one of scandal or defiance, it's one of adaptation. A woman born into dynastic chess who managed to survive it without becoming a casualty of the game. But the age gap never disappeared. It loomed quietly, politically, over every nursery rhyme, every royal portrait, every ceremonial event where the bride looked more like a daughter and the groom more like a patriarch with a coronet. And just when you think the pattern might break, just when you suspect the court might learn to stop pairing monarchs with women young enough to need a guardian, the story shifts northward, to Scotland, where a young royal woman, just barely out of her first marriage, found herself married again. This time, to a man nearly 40 years her senior. And unlike Margaret, she wouldn't be remembered for calm. Mary Stuart and James Hamilton, First Lord Hamilton. By the mid-15th century, Scotland was less a kingdom and more a prolonged family argument, with a crown tossed somewhere in the middle. Its nobles were restless, its alliances brittle, and its thrones at times almost optional. Into this ever-tilting chessboard stepped Mary Stuart, the eldest daughter of James II of Scotland. She was royal by birth, political by upbringing, and unlucky by marital contract. Her first husband, Thomas Boyd, Lord Boyd of Kilmarnock, had been a bold but ultimately doomed alliance. He was young, ambitious, and unfortunate enough to be at the wrong end of the ever-changing political winds. His family fell out of favour within years of the marriage, and he was exiled, declared a traitor, and stripped of his titles. Mary, still a teenager, was left behind alone in court, scandal at her heels, and with her own legitimacy suddenly called into question. She had options. Royal daughters always did. But none of them were particularly good. Enter James Hamilton, First Lord Hamilton, a man who had somehow managed to walk through every political crisis of the past decade without getting executed, a rare skill in Scotland. He was somewhere in his late 50s, had previously been married, and had children of his own already knocking around the noble circuit. And yet, in 1474, he married Mary. She was around 21. He was pushing 60, an age gap of nearly 40 years. Not entirely scandalous in the 15th century, but still eyebrow-raising, even in Edinburgh. So why did she marry him? The simplest answer is survival. After the downfall of the Boyds, Mary's political capital was spent. Her position at court was shaky. Her children from her first marriage were under scrutiny, and her ability to act independently was almost non-existent. Marrying Hamilton meant aligning herself with one of the most politically secure noblemen in Scotland, a man whose ties to the royal family and well-honed instincts had kept him on the right side of almost every purge. But there was another reason, one that wasn't written in official documents, or carved into stone. James Hamilton was connected, not just socially, genetically. He was a descendant of Scottish royalty, albeit a few branches removed, and Mary's marriage to him would eventually provide the Hamilton family with a legitimate, blood-based claim to the Scottish throne. One that, centuries later, would complicate the royal succession in ways no one in 1474 could possibly have predicted. But for Mary, the practicalities came first. The marriage gave her protection, influence, and a return to royal legitimacy. She became Lady Hamilton, bore several more children, including James Hamilton, 1st Earl of Arran, and re-established herself as a key player in Scottish dynastic politics. Her children would go on to become powerful lords, regents, and conspirators. The Hamilton line would entangle itself with the royal family so tightly that, by the time Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived on the scene, the Hamiltons were practically family in the most ominous way possible. But what of the marriage itself? Records are sparse, as usual. There are no passionate love letters, no dramatic court poems, no chroniclers waxing poetic about moonlit affections. What we have instead are property transfers, land charters, and witness statements, breadcrumbs of a practical, functional union. Whether there was affection is unknowable. What we do know is that Mary survived it. And that is, in its own way, remarkable. Because many women in her position didn't. Her life had begun with royal promise, veered into scandal, and rerouted through pragmatism. By the time she died in 1488, Mary Stuart had navigated 2 marriages, a political fall and a dynastic resurrection. She wasn't remembered for rebellion, but for continuity, for enduring. James Hamilton, for his part, outlived her by about 2 years. He had built a dynasty, one that would outlast kings, queens, and even the idea of an independent Scotland. His children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would continue to haunt the edges of royal succession like politely smiling ghosts, always close enough to the crown to matter, never quite close enough to seize it. It's a story of compromise, of noble math, of power disguised as matrimony. And the age gap, well, it just sat there, like the stone walls of Kadzau Castle, quiet, cold, and slightly too large to ignore. And if you think that was unsettling, the next union takes us from castles to cathedrals, where a girl still learning to read her own name was wed to a man with an archduchy and a calendar already full of funerals. Catherine of Saxony and Sigismund, Archduke of Austria. Some marriages are built on shared ambition, others on political necessity. And then there are the ones that seem held together by sheer arithmetic, painful, deliberate, and so imbalanced in age that even the most generous chroniclers reach for euphemisms like unequal match or unlikely union. Catherine of Saxony and Sigismund, Archduke of Austria, belongs squarely in that last category. He was 56, she was 16, a 40-year gulf, and not just in age. Sigismund had been on the political chessboard longer than Catherine had been alive. Born in 1427, he was one of those noblemen who seemed to exist entirely within the machinery of empire, placed, married, negotiated, and eventually left to rule a sliver of the Holy Roman Empire with more debt than power. As the Habsburg ruler of Tyrol and further Austria, he spent much of his reign balancing the needs of rival noble houses, unpaid soldiers, and creditors who regularly circled like vultures in silk doublets. By the time he began looking for a second wife, his career had taken a distinctly downward slope. His first wife, Eleanor of Scotland, had died in 1480. It had been, by most accounts, a respectable and politically useful marriage, though it produced no children who survived infancy. With his inheritance under threat and his authority increasingly questioned by the Habsburg family at large, Sigismund faced a familiar royal problem: legacy. He needed an heir. Or, at the very least, the appearance of trying for one. Catherine, by contrast, was just beginning her life. She was the daughter of Albert III, Duke of Saxony, and Sidonie of Podebrady, royal enough to matter, but not so powerful as to be dangerous. At 16, she had spent more time learning courtly manners and theological Latin than contemplating the finer points of Habsburg succession. She had no meaningful say in the marriage, of course. Few noblewomen did, but on paper it was an honor, marrying into one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, ascending to a title, and presumably securing a future in which her survival and obedience would be richly rewarded. They were married in 1484. The ceremony was reportedly lavish, though lavish in the late 15th century Habsburg sense, meaning full of gilt-edged promise and debt-financed grandeur. Sigismund, now approaching 60, was visibly aging, increasingly frustrated by his dwindling influence, and often embroiled in financial disputes with the cities under his rule. He had, by this time, pawned off large swaths of Tyrolean territory to pay off war debts. His councillors had grown wary, his courtiers resentful. But still he had a young wife. And in royal logic, that meant possibility. The public expectation was clear. A child would secure his succession and quiet the murmurs of impending political collapse. But the child never came. Catherine and Sigismund's marriage, despite its ceremonial gloss, remained childless. Whether the failure lay in age, biology, or simple incompatibility, no one could say out loud. The chronicles of the time were politely silent, as if not mentioning the obvious might somehow make it disappear. But the silence said enough. More interesting, perhaps, was Catherine's role in court after the wedding. Despite her youth, she quickly proved herself more than a ceremonial bride. Accounts suggest she was dignified, intelligent, and strategically cautious traits she would need in abundance, because Sigismund's rule was collapsing around them. By 1490, just 6 years into their marriage, Sigismund was forced to abdicate. Pressured by Emperor Frederick III and the increasingly powerful Maximilian I, his own cousin, and eventual successor, Sigismund relinquished control of Tyrol and further Austria. His reign ended not with a rebellion, but with a quiet, dignified step backward. A man too old to fight and too proud to beg. Catherine, still only in her 20s, now found herself the consort of a man with no crown, no real estate, and very little relevance. They lived out their remaining years in near retirement. She became more involved in religious patronage. He withdrew into ceremony and reflection. Sigismund died in 1496. Catherine, still barely over 30, lived another 4 years before passing away in 1501. She never remarried. Whether this was out of loyalty, strategy, or exhaustion is anyone's guess. What remains of their union is mostly paperwork. A few letters, some land transfers, the odd marginal note from a visiting ambassador remarking on the contrast between the aged Archduke and his youthful bride. No scandals, no legends. Just a union conducted under the weight of dynastic necessity and preserved in the folds of court protocol. But within that silence, there's something quietly tragic. Sigismund's late-stage political collapse was mirrored by a personal one. His attempt to salvage his legacy by marrying young didn't just fail, it underscored how little control he had left. And Catherine, though elevated to the status of Archduchess, spent her formative years surrounded not by hope or family, but by the slow unraveling of a kingdom and the bitterness of a man outlived by his own ambitions. It's a cautionary tale dressed up as a diplomatic victory, a reminder that marriage, in royal terms, was less about affection and more about arithmetic. And sometimes, when the math gets desperate enough, it starts to look like history repeating itself, like another old ruler, another teenage bride, and another wedding designed to patch a political hole. Which brings us to Bavaria, where a girl of barely 18 found herself matched to a 70-year-old elector who wore his wig like armor and treated fatherhood like a public service announcement. Maria Leopoldine of Austria-Este, and Charles Theodore, Elector of Bavaria. If royal marriages were graded on optics alone, the union between Maria Leopoldine of Austria-Este and Charles Theodore of Bavaria would be an F wrapped in ermine. It was the kind of dynastic arrangement that makes historians quietly sigh and reach for the footnotes. The year was 1795. Europe was on fire, literally and politically. The French Revolution had destabilized the continent. Monarchies were watching guillotines with renewed paranoia, and the Austrian Habsburgs were doubling down on old tricks. Fortify alliances, marry off nieces, and pretend everything was under control. Maria Leopoldine, at the center of this, was 18 years old. She had Habsburg blood, Este heritage, and all the right vowels in her titles. She was a political asset in a very expensive dress. Charles Theodore, her assigned husband, was 70. He was not just older, he was old, grandfatherly old, Georgian period old. The kind of old where his political views had been outdated for a generation and his personal habits were widely considered tragic, if not slightly absurd. He had been Elector of Bavaria since 1777, an uninspiring ruler at best, a punchline at worst. His politics were indecisive, his reforms cosmetic, and his court full of the kind of men who measured importance in wig powder. He had a legitimate claim to power, but barely the charisma to hold a dinner party together. His first wife, Elizabeth Auguste of Sulzbach, had been more of a reluctant roommate than a partner, and she'd predeceased him in 1794. The court had barely cleared the mourning drapes before the next wedding was arranged. Because what Charles Theodore needed urgently was an heir. Technically, Bavaria had succession options, but none that pleased Charles. He was determined to extend his own line, to silence the murmurs about dynastic collapse. And so, with a logic known only to monarchs and marriage brokers, he arranged to marry Maria Leopoldine. The alliance was politically sound. The Austrian connection might bolster his position. The youth of his bride might, in theory, produce the son he'd never had. The plan had everything except plausibility. Because what played out over the next 2 years wasn't a royal love story or even a functional partnership. It was a symbolic performance. A very expensive, very awkward performance in which a teenage archduchess was made to play consort to a man who was, by most accounts, already planning his own funeral. Maria Leopoldine arrived in Munich to little fanfare and no illusions. She was intelligent, well-read, and reportedly sharp-witted traits that did not go unnoticed by courtiers. But she was also young, isolated, and entirely unprepared for the court she'd been dropped into. Charles Theodore's court was not exactly Versailles. It was a faded copy, ornate, stiff, and hopelessly out of touch. The salons were quiet, the rituals repetitive, and the atmosphere stifling. His courtiers called him their Alte behind his back. The old one, not out of cruelty, but boredom. Maria Leopoldine tried to fulfill her duties. She appeared at ceremonies, smiled when expected, and performed the role of Bavarian electress with grace. But the expected heir never came. In truth, it was never going to. Charles Theodore, despite his optimism, was not exactly in reproductive shape. He had mistresses, sure dozens of them over the years, but he was nearing the end of the line, biologically and politically. His health was deteriorating, his grasp on the electorate was growing tenuous, and his ability to secure a male heir, pure fantasy. He died in 1799, just 4 years after the marriage. Maria Leopoldine, still barely out of her teenage years, was suddenly a dowager. She had no children, no real political leverage, and no claim to anything but her title. But here's where her story diverges from the usual royal widow narrative. She didn't retreat. Instead, she reinvented. Following Charles's death, Maria Leopoldine remained in Bavaria for a time before returning to Austria. She became a patron of the arts, an advocate for education, and a respected figure in intellectual circles. She remarried this time for personal rather than political reasons to Count Ludwig von Arco, a man significantly closer to her own age and status. Their marriage was by all accounts more balanced, more affectionate, and more real. In this sense, Maria Leopoldine's life reads like a quiet act of rebellion. A royal woman who fulfilled her dynastic duty, endured the absurdity of being married to a man old enough to be her great-grandfather, and then went on to craft a life on her own terms. But the original marriage, the one history insists on remembering, was not about her. It was about Charles Theodore's desperation, his belief that legacy could be salvaged by youth, that a teenage bride could reset the clock. It couldn't. Instead, it froze the moment in amber, a court out of time, a marriage out of proportion, and a kingdom waiting for something that never arrived. And just as that court was fading into obscurity, another royal union was being staged, this time between a young English princess and a French king more interested in deathbed diplomacy than domestic bliss. A marriage that would last only weeks, but leave a question lingering for centuries. What exactly does a teenage bride owe to a dying monarch? Mary Tudor, Queen of France, and King Louis XII. Royal marriages are often described as strategic, but strategic is just a polite way of saying someone, somewhere, made a sacrifice. And in the case of Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII and briefly Queen of France, the sacrifice was personal, spectacularly theatrical, and timed so poorly it could have been a Greek tragedy with better wardrobe. Mary was 18, intelligent, glamorous, fluent in dance, music, and 5 languages. She was said to be one of the most beautiful women in Europe, her brother Henry's favourite sibling, and one of the few people who could speak to him without flinching. She was also, in the eyes of the English crown, a diplomatic bargaining chip. And then there was Louis XII, 52 years old, twice widowed, worn down by decades of war, gout, and the weight of French bureaucracy. He was not exactly a heartthrob. He was more like the walking embodiment of political urgency. France needed an heir fast, and Louis was just old enough to feel the ticking clock in his bones. His first 2 wives, Jeanne of France and Anne of Brittany, had failed to produce a surviving male heir. The pressure was now unbearable. So what do you do when the throne needs stability and the king needs an heir? You marry him off to the young, royal, and impossibly photogenic sister of the King of England. The marriage was political theatre from the beginning. Henry VIII, newly crowned and eager to show his chops as a European power broker, agreed to send his sister as a goodwill offering to the French court. In return, England got a temporary peace, a political alliance, and if all went according to plan, a bit of breathing room from the endless tug-of-war over continental territory. Mary, for her part, was furious. She had other plans. Her heart reportedly belonged to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, a man of high birth, modest influence, and not nearly enough crowns to make the French match disappear. She begged Henry not to make her go. She wept, protested, bargained, and then, realizing she had no leverage, made a final request. If she did this, if she married Louis XII, the ailing King of France, Henry must promise that once the old man died, she could marry whomever she chose. Henry agreed, though, being Henry, the definition of promise would prove flexible later on. So Mary Tudor sailed to France, glowing in silks and furs, her jaw set like a guillotine. The wedding took place in October 1514. The court called it glorious. Eyewitnesses described the bride as radiant and the groom as present. To the public, the union was a triumph of diplomacy. England and France were allied by blood. The continent breathed a cautious sigh of relief. And in private, it was a waiting game. Louis XII was not in great health. He suffered from persistent illness, swollen joints, and a constitution eroded by decades of royal excess. Still, he clung to the hope that his young, beautiful wife might provide him with the one thing he'd always lacked: a son. He doubled down on ceremony. He held lavish feasts, public appearances, and attempted to embody youthful vigor with the desperation of a man who knew time was no longer a political ally. And then, after 82 days of marriage, he died. Just like that. The official cause? A sudden illness. The unofficial consensus? The strain of trying to act 30 when he was, in fact, 52, and in failing health. The French court shifted instantly, mourning in public, manoeuvring in private. And Mary? Barely out of her teenage years, she found herself widowed, titled, and dangerously attractive in the eyes of every French noble with a half-baked claim to the throne. But Mary remembered her bargain. She had upheld her end, married the man, danced the dances, waited. Now she wanted her prize, Charles Brandon. And here's where things get messy. Henry VIII, suddenly realizing that his sister was now one of the most eligible women in Europe, got cold feet. She was too valuable, too political, too useful to be married off to a court favorite with charm and no real strategic worth. He hesitated. So Mary and Charles took matters into their own hands. They married secretly and without permission. It was a scandal. A diplomatic incident, a headline event. Henry was livid. But eventually, with enough groveling, bribes, and public relations work, he forgave them. Partly because Mary was stubborn, partly because Charles Brandon was a loyal subject, and partly because Henry had already moved on to more pressing matters, like which of his wives he'd eventually come to regret. Mary and Charles lived out their days quietly, by Tudor standards. Their marriage lasted nearly 2 decades. She never returned to the kind of political stage she'd occupied in France, but she didn't seem to mind. She had chosen, for once, something for herself. As for Louis XII, he was buried in Saint-Denis, France's royal necropolis, with 2 failed dynastic marriages and 1 very brief teenage queen. No heir, no lasting peace, no fairy tale ending. Just a wedding that briefly calmed a continent and a death that reminded everyone how little time even kings have. And if you think 82 days of marriage was short, wait until we meet a modern royal whose wedding photos look like a fairy tale, but whose story, in hindsight, reads like a contract disguised as a ceremony. Prince Albert II of Monaco and Princess Charlene. In a palace perched above the Mediterranean, a prince once promised the world a fairy tale. The press called it a modern romance. The tabloids called it a real-life Cinderella story. The bride was an Olympian. The groom a lifelong bachelor finally ready to settle down. The setting, Monte Carlo. The mood, cautiously optimistic. But behind the pearl-white smiles and royal monograms, the marriage of Prince Albert II of Monaco and Charlene Wittstock played out like a sun-drenched soap opera, one where the ocean glittered and the questions never quite stopped. Prince Albert II was 53 when he married Charlene. She was 33. A 20-year age gap, not the largest in royal history by far, but enough to make headlines, especially in a monarchy already steeped in myth and melodrama. Charlene wasn't born into royalty. She was born in Zimbabwe and raised in South Africa. Her childhood was defined by discipline, not decadence. She trained as a swimmer and became an Olympic athlete. By the time she met Albert in 2000, she had competed internationally, carried national expectations, and lived a life measured in seconds and finishes. Albert, meanwhile, had spent most of his life navigating the curious paradox of being a royal in a kingdom smaller than most city parks. Monaco is a microstate, yes, but its monarchy is a global spectacle. His father, Prince Rainier III, married Grace Kelly, an American movie star turned princess, forever immortalized in grainy paparazzi shots and mid-century glamour. Albert grew up in the glare of the camera, under the weight of his mother's legacy and his father's political balancing act. He didn't marry young. In fact, he didn't marry at all, at least not until he was past 50. By the time he proposed to Charlene in 2010, he was already the subject of endless speculation. Playboy prince, commitment phobe, scandal manager. The palace never said it out loud, but everyone knew the unspoken truth. This marriage wasn't just romantic, it was constitutional. Albert needed legitimacy. Specifically, he needed a legitimate heir. Because Monaco, for all its yachts and casinos, was still a hereditary monarchy. And while Albert had acknowledged 2 children born outside of wedlock, one with a Togolese flight attendant, another with an American estate agent, neither could inherit the throne. The law was clear. No marriage, no succession. So when Charlene accepted his proposal, it felt like a royal solution to a very modern problem. But the fairy tale showed cracks early. Rumors swirled almost immediately. French newspapers speculated that Charlene had cold feet, that she tried to flee the country days before the wedding, that her passport had been confiscated. The palace denied everything. Of course, the wedding proceeded, 2 days of ceremony, designer gowns, European dignitaries, fireworks over the harbour. Charlene cried at the altar. The press called them tears of joy. The internet called them something else entirely. Since then, the marriage has been more enigmatic than scandalous. Charlene became Princess of Monaco. She attended official functions, smiled on balconies, posed with grace, but something about her presence felt removed. The princess who once swam the 100-meter backstroke in international competition now appeared in public with the tense stillness of a guest in her own life. She lived in Monaco, then South Africa, then returned to Monaco, often amid rumors of medical treatment, emotional strain, or just vague exhaustion. At one point, she spent 10 months away from the principality. The palace insisted it was health-related. The tabloids speculated about everything else. And Albert? He remained composed, the seasoned royal, fluent in diplomacy, but never quite able to silence the quiet sense that, somewhere along the line, this wasn't the story it was supposed to be. In 2014, the couple welcomed twins, Princess Gabriella and Prince Jacques. The succession was secure. The throne had an heir. And yet, the public fascination didn't fade. Because this was no ordinary royal couple. They didn't bicker in tabloids. They didn't explode on social media. They simply existed. Politely, elegantly, like mannequins in a historical reenactment. And in that elegance lies the real intrigue. Because modern royalty doesn't die in scandal, it withers in ambiguity. And the marriage of Albert and Charlene might be the most ambiguous of them all. A prince whose life was shaped by legacy. A bride who stepped into that legacy and never quite found her footing. A monarchy that needed stability. A contract dressed as a coronation. Even now, when they appear together at state events, foundation galas, or Monaco's endless charity circuits, there's something theatrical about it. A perfectly choreographed performance. As if the marriage has become not just a reality, but a responsibility. And in that, they may be more royal than most. Because in the world of monarchies, it's not love that guarantees survival, it's appearances, paperwork, bloodlines. Which brings us, with poetic symmetry, to another royal marriage shaped by responsibility rather than desire. One set not in palaces or photo ops, but in the burning heart of the Middle East, where a king sought an elegant young bride to balance politics, legacy, and the complicated mathematics of monarchy. King Hussein of Jordan and Queen Noor. In the grand theatre of modern monarchy, few stages are more delicately balanced than the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. It's a country perched between tradition and modernity, tribal allegiance and global diplomacy, history, and the slow, grinding weight of the future. And into that arena stepped Lisa Najib Halaby, a Princeton-educated, multilingual, American-born architecture student who would one day be crowned Queen Noor of Jordan. But let's rewind. The year is 1978. King Hussein of Jordan is 42 years old. A hardened, pragmatic survivor of coups, wars, and assassination attempts. He has ruled Jordan since 1952, his reign beginning at the age of 16, after the assassination of his grandfather. Over the years, he has transformed from a teenage monarch into a seasoned, calculating political operator. He has married 3 times, he has children, he has enemies, and he has, by this point, begun to age in the full public glare of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Enter Lisa Halaby, aged 26. The daughter of Najib Halaby, former head of Pan Am and an aviation advisor under the Kennedy administration, Lisa was a product of American ambition. She was born in Washington, D.C., raised between global cities, and educated in a cultural milieu more familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright than Islamic dynasties. Her connection to Jordan began through work she joined the Royal Jordanian Airline on a design and development project, and it was through this professional role that she met the king. A widower, at the time his 3rd wife, Queen Alia, had died in a tragic helicopter crash. King Hussein was mourning, aging, and increasingly reflective. He was also still king, which meant that grief and duty coexisted awkwardly in his public life. Lisa, with her worldliness, poise, and rare ability to navigate both Western and Arab cultural codes, stood out. Their courtship was brief. By June of 1978, they were married. And with that, Lisa Halaby became Noor al-Hussein, Light of Hussein, the new Queen of Jordan. The age gap? About 16 years. Modest by royal standards, perhaps, but significant enough to raise eyebrows in the West, where many still viewed Jordan through a lens of exoticism and Cold War condescension. In the Middle East, however, it was seen as something far more complex, a signal. Because Hussein hadn't just married a woman, he had married a message. That message said, Jordan is modern, Jordan is international, Jordan is reformist but grounded, Western educated but rooted in Islam, forward-looking but not revolutionary. Noor quickly became more than a symbol. She took on public duties, cultural ambassadorship, and eventually real influence in matters of policy. She promoted education, urban planning, women's rights, and the arts. She learned Arabic, converted to Islam, and navigated the intensely scrutinized role of royal consort with a discipline that veiled just how much pressure rested on her every appearance. But no matter how active she became in public life, her marriage remained the foundation and the mystery. By all public accounts, Hussein and Noor shared a deep bond. He was drawn to her intellect, her poise, her quiet refusal to play the passive queen. She brought a modern presence to a monarchy that had long walked a tightrope between appeasing conservative clerics and reassuring Western allies. Still, the age gap defined the power dynamic. Hussein was the central figure politically, historically, and personally. Noor was, at least initially, a supporting character in a kingdom where the king's word was not merely law, but legacy. Their marriage lasted over 2 decades, during which Noor gave birth to 4 children and navigated the shifting tectonics of a region in near-constant crisis. From Black September to the Gulf War, from peace negotiations with Israel to internal reforms, Hussein ruled with the dual instincts of a monarch and a survivor. And through it all, Noor stood beside him not merely as a consort, but increasingly as a trusted advisor. When Hussein's health began to deteriorate in the 1,992 cancer treatments, relapses, it was Noor who took on a more visible role. Her public grace in those years, as the king visibly weakened, earned her admiration even from critics of the monarchy. But there was also a subtle anxiety beneath the admiration. What happens to a queen when the king dies? In 1999, Hussein passed away. His chosen successor was not his eldest son from a previous marriage, nor one of Noor's children. It was Abdullah II, his son by Princess Muna, a former British military nurse and Hussein's second wife. The transition was smooth, formal, and presented as the king's final command. But for Noor, it marked a quiet end to political centrality. She became Queen Dowager, mother to princes without thrones, a living symbol of a political era that had just closed. Her life after Hussein has been dignified, charitable, and often sharply observant. She speaks at global forums, promotes disarmament, writes books, and occasionally surfaces in interviews that remind people she was never just a consort. She was, and remains, a strategist. Their marriage, while not scandalous or volatile, remains a curious fixture in modern royal history, a political alignment cloaked in personal affection. A bond forged across continents, languages, and dynastic expectations. A love story, perhaps. Or maybe just the kind of high-functioning arrangement where affection and diplomacy sit side by side, knowing better than to step on each other's toes. Because in the world of royal unions, not every story is about romance or tragedy. Some are about endurance, some are about performance, and some, like the next one, are about rewriting the script entirely, with a king who was old enough to be his bride's father and a princess young enough to think that meant safety. King William IV and Queen Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. By the time William IV finally became King of the United Kingdom in 1830, he was in his mid-60s, balding, cantankerous, and deeply ambivalent about the whole business of monarchy. He had spent most of his life as the spare, a naval officer, a man about town, and the kind of royal relative whose primary job was to avoid embarrassing the crown too much while waiting, eternally, in the wings. He had also spent much of that life with a woman he never married. For 20 years, William lived openly with the Irish actress Dorothea Jordan. They had 10 children together, known collectively as the Fitzclarences, a surname given to illegitimate royal offspring with more social courtesy than legal status. William genuinely cared for her, and their domestic life was by all accounts surprisingly warm, even affectionate. But affection isn't inheritance. And when his older brother, George IV, died without a legitimate heir, everything changed. Suddenly, the British crown was within reach, and suddenly, William needed a wife. Not a mistress, not a partner. A queen, preferably young, preferably fertile, preferably not interested in causing trouble. Enter Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. She was everything Dorothea Jordan wasn't. Reserved, noble, German, childless, and 27 years younger than William. The age gap? About 27 years. In 1818, Adelaide was 25 years old. A modest princess from a minor German duchy, her life was destined for quiet dignity or strategic marriage, whichever came first. When British agents began searching Europe for suitable royal brides, she was seen as a safe bet. No political baggage, no extravagant demands, no grand ambitions. Just a pious, obedient young woman with the right bloodline and, crucially, the possibility of bearing an heir to stabilize the line of succession. They were married within weeks of meeting. The wedding was held quickly, almost as a formality, and without the sentimental fanfare that would become typical in later royal unions. William was 52, impatient, and already somewhat skeptical of matrimony. Adelaide was 25, reserved, and likely aware that her role would be less about companionship and more about dynastic repair. Yet, in an odd twist that history tends to brush past too quickly, the marriage worked. Not in the romantic sense, not a fairy tale, but in its own way, it was functional, cooperative, and unexpectedly loyal. Adelaide took her duties seriously. She was devout, discreet, and sincerely invested in moral propriety, which made her an odd match for a husband who had spent the better part of 4 decades dabbling in scandal, mistresses, and political irreverence. William, for his part, seemed genuinely grateful for her calm. He respected her, he listened to her, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he didn't mock her piety. He leaned on it. What they shared wasn't chemistry. It was compatibility, forged in circumstance. But fate was less cooperative. Despite several pregnancies, none of their children survived infancy. One daughter lived long enough to be named Elizabeth, but died at 12 weeks old. The rest were miscarriages or stillbirths. For a royal couple, especially one married with such clear reproductive expectations, this was both a personal tragedy and a public disappointment. And yet, Adelaide never lost her footing. She didn't retreat into bitterness. She didn't lash out. Instead, she became a maternal figure to William's illegitimate children, showing kindness where others might have shown contempt. She extended her grace beyond the nursery and into the public sphere, supporting hospitals, orphanages, and social reforms. She was especially known for her philanthropic work during times of economic distress, often giving more than protocol demanded. When William ascended the throne in 1830, the country didn't know what to expect. He was elderly, gruff, and often uncensored in public. But Adelaide brought a stabilizing presence to the monarchy, soft-spoken, dependable, and consistent. Her modesty, once seen as a liability, became an unexpected asset during an era of growing public scrutiny and political reform. Together, they managed. Not glamorously, not charismatically, but with a kind of quiet endurance that, paradoxically, made them modern. When William died in 1837 after just 7 years on the throne, it was Adelaide who stood at the intersection of legacy and transition. She had no child to place on the throne, but she helped steward the monarchy into the Victorian era by modelling what a constitutional consort could look like: dutiful, restrained, and above the political fray. She spent the remaining 12 years of her life as Queen Dowager, maintaining a small household and continuing her charitable work. In a royal world obsessed with airs and image, she became a symbol of something else entirely: integrity without spectacle. Their marriage may not be remembered for romance or grandeur, but it was something rarer, a royal partnership that didn't collapse under the weight of its own expectations. And in that, It stands in quiet contrast to many other unions in royal history, especially the ones where affection, ambition, and anxiety all combusted in spectacular fashion. Like, say, the next monarch in line, whose own matrimonial decisions would make William's domestic life look like a Sunday picnic, and whose court would revolve not around compatibility, but chaos disguised as ceremony. Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. If the Tudor dynasty were a novel, Henry VIII would be the character you couldn't stop reading about and absolutely wouldn't trust near your daughter. He was larger than life, dangerously impulsive, and permanently entangled in the kind of court drama that made Game of Thrones look like a dispute at a neighbourhood council. By the time Jane Seymour entered the picture in 1536, Henry was 45 years old, not ancient by royal standards, but significantly weathered. He had already ruled for nearly 3 decades, rewritten the country's relationship with the Pope, and famously dissolved one marriage to marry another. And then, just as famously, he dissolved that second marriage as well, only with a sword instead of a divorce. Jane, by contrast, was about 28. That made the age gap a modest 17 years tame compared to medieval pairings, and almost respectable by royal standards. But in every other respect, the imbalance was glaring. Henry was, at this point, no longer the golden-haired Renaissance prince of his early portraits. He was growing heavier, moodier, and increasingly paranoid. His leg wound, the result of a jousting accident, had begun to fester both medically and metaphorically. And more critically, his emotional landscape had become a political battlefield. He had failed to produce a male heir with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and failed again more dramatically with his second, Anne Boleyn. Jane, whether she knew it or not, was walking into the storm that had broken queens before her. But Jane was different. She was not fiery like Anne, not politically astute like Catherine. She was quiet, demure, unassuming. Where Anne had sparked scandal, Jane soothed tension. Where Catherine had resisted, Jane yielded, or at least she appeared to. She came from a relatively minor noble family, the Seymours of Wolfhall. No great dowries, no powerful international ties, just enough pedigree to make her royal consort material, and enough modesty to make her seem safe. That word safe is doing a lot of work here. Jane's rise was swift and eerily seamless. She became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, then to Queen Anne, and finally, the Queen herself. Historians still debate whether she was a passive figure swept up in Henry's dynastic obsession or a quiet architect of her own ascent. But whichever version you choose, the reality is this. Days after Anne Boleyn's execution, Jane Seymour was proclaimed Queen of England. Not weeks, not months, days. The public reaction was mixed. Some welcomed her as a calming presence. Others whispered that she had profited from blood. But Jane remained largely above the fray. She made no sweeping changes. She distanced herself from Anne's reformist religious circle. She rarely involved herself in politics, with one notable exception: the return of Princess Mary, Henry's estranged daughter from his first marriage. It was Jane who helped facilitate Mary's re-entry into court life, an act of familial diplomacy that earned her quiet respect from many corners of the realm. But Jane wasn't brought in to be a mediator, she was brought in to bear a son. And in 1537, after more than a year of growing pressure, she did. The birth of Edward VI was Henry's long-awaited moment of vindication. Finally, an heir, a legitimate male heir, born to a queen who hadn't needed divorces or executions to secure her place. The court erupted in celebration. Bells rang across the kingdom. Henry, never known for modesty, declared that all his hopes had been fulfilled. Jane, however, would not live to see the consequences. Just 12 days after giving birth, she died most likely from postnatal complications. It was the first time in Henry's reign that a queen had died without scandal. No annulment, no exile, no execution. Just grief, both public and private. And here lies the irony. Jane Seymour, the queen who spoke the least, left the loudest echo in Henry's mind. He married 3 more times after her, but he was buried beside her. Not Catherine, not Anne, Jane. In his later years, bloated and embittered, Henry would reportedly speak of Jane with a kind of wistful reverence. She had given him what no other woman had, a son, a sense of completion, a temporary illusion of stability. But the illusion didn't last. Edward VI would become king at 9 and die at 15, leaving no heir. The Tudor succession would unravel again into a tragic web of regents, half-siblings, and bitter legitimacy crises. So what, in the end, did that 17-year age gap produce? A single male heir, a fleeting moment of dynastic clarity, and the Queen Henry would choose to be entombed beside. Jane Seymour never ruled, never led armies, never wrote manifestos, but she entered history as the woman who completed a king, if only for a moment. And if that sounds like the neat end to a royal love story, don't worry, it isn't. Because the next marriage in our chronicle is the same story told in reverse. A young girl married to an aging king, tasked not with soothing his rage but resurrecting a dying dynasty, all under the watchful eye of a court that measured her worth in babies and bloodlines. Adeliza of Louvain and Henry I of England. History rarely gives second chances, but kings tend to take them anyway, especially when succession is on the line. By the time Henry I of England decided to remarry in 1121, he was 53 years old and freshly widowed. He had ruled England for over 2 decades with a cold efficiency that made him feared, respected, and very much alone. His first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died the year before. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, had drowned in the White Ship disaster, a tragedy so severe it threatened to undo his entire dynasty. And suddenly, Henry King, conqueror, prolific father of bastards, had no male heir. The political clock was ticking. Enter Adeliza of Louvain. She was young, titled, devout, and, most critically, childless. Not in a negative sense, just in the sense that her body had not yet been tasked with solving a nation's dynastic crisis. At around 18 years old, she was half Henry's age, and then some. The age gap between them was 35 years, give or take a politically sanitized birthday. She was the daughter of Godfrey I, Count of Leuven, a strategic continental ally, minor in power, but rich in royal bloodlines. Her pedigree was impeccable, her education pious, and her appearance widely praised. Chroniclers described her as beautiful and chaste, a combination that made her a medieval unicorn, desirable and uncontested. They were married in January 1121, less than a year after Henry's first wife had died. The court moved quickly. There were no romantic declarations, no drawn-out courtships. Henry needed a solution, and Adeliza's youth was an answer, dressed in white. The public narrative was simple. Henry, grieving but responsible, had found a suitable queen to help produce the much-needed heir. But beneath that carefully curated story was the quiet reality that she was a teenager, married to a man older than her own father, with the future of a kingdom resting squarely on her womb. And then nothing happened. No pregnancy, no heir, no dynasty salvaged. Over the course of their 13-year marriage, Adeliza and Henry produced no children, not a son, not a daughter, not a whisper of hope. In a time when a queen's worth was almost exclusively measured in offspring, this silence became its own kind of scandal. A whisper campaign without volume, but with consequences. Of course, no one could say it was her fault. Not publicly. Henry was in his mid-50s by the time of the wedding, old by 12th century standards, and hardly a symbol of peak virility. But he had over 20 acknowledged illegitimate children, a fact he seemed almost proud of. He was, in the words of one chronicler, remarkably fecund. The implication was clear. If no heir came from this union, the problem wasn't the king. But time, as always, had its own agenda. Henry died in 1135. His one legitimate son remained dead at sea. Adeliza, now in her early 30s and still childless, found herself in a familiar royal role, widowed and irrelevant. Only, she didn't vanish. Adeliza withdrew to a convent temporarily, as expected, but then did something quietly rebellious. She remarried, not to a king, not to a foreign prince, but to William d'Aubigny, a nobleman of significantly lower status, known for loyalty and military service, but not royal blood. And then almost immediately she had children. Lots of them. 7, to be exact. The timing was poetic. Adeliza, once thought barren, turned out to be fertile after all. It was Henry who could no longer produce an heir. The dynasty collapsed not because of her failure, but his. And yet, history never quite rewrote the story in her favor. Instead, she became a historical footnote, a quiet queen, a transitional figure. But look closer, and she becomes something else entirely. Adeliza's second marriage wasn't just a personal redemption, it was a correction. She lived out her days, raising her children, managing estates, and operating from the political sidelines with far more independence than she had ever known as queen. She died in 1151, largely forgotten by the crown she once served, but very much remembered by the descendants she left behind. There's a strange justice in it. The woman who had been used as a last-ditch effort to save a royal line ended up creating one of her own outside the throne, beyond the reach of the crown, and entirely on her own terms. And yet, the pattern continued. Because for kings who had run out of time or sons, there was always one more marriage to arrange, one more young bride to summon, one more gamble to play with someone else's life. Which brings us, with familiar discomfort, back to the same royal players, because some age gaps are so staggering they circle back again, as if history can't stop itself from repeating the same quiet contradictions. Richard II and Isabella of Valois revisiting. Some stories aren't told twice because they changed, but because the world didn't. When Richard II of England married Isabella of Valois in 1396, the union was billed as a diplomatic miracle, a truce between two warring nations, a symbol of peace, strength, and royal self-control. It was also, rather disturbingly, a grown man marrying a child. Richard was 29, Isabella was 6. We've already seen this marriage, once examined it under the lens of diplomacy, grief, and symbolic politics. But revisiting it again isn't redundant, it's necessary. Because when the same story refuses to disappear, it becomes a pattern. And patterns have a way of explaining the things no one wants to admit. The first time around, we looked at the marriage as an anomaly. Now we look at it for what it really was. Institutionalized repetition. Richard's reasons for marrying Isabella were not romantic, nor even purely dynastic. They were tactical. England and France had been locked in the 100 Years' War, an exhausting, slow-burning feud that had drained coffers, ruined crops, and blurred the line between national pride and generational vengeance. Richard needed a ceasefire. France needed leverage. And a marriage, however unsettling, was the quickest way to draw a neat line between enemies and pretend it was a bridge. To that end, Isabella was perfect. Young enough to be unthreatening, French enough to be useful, and royal enough to sanctify the treaty with the full blessing of God and court alike. She was paraded across England as the future queen, dressed in gold-threaded gowns too large for her frame, her tiny hand tucked into Richard's as if it were a formal accessory. The public was instructed to celebrate. The nobility was advised to nod. No one was supposed to ask questions, and to their credit, few did. Even chroniclers of the time, who rarely resisted a chance to inject drama into royal records, were remarkably restrained. They described Isabella as precocious, Richard as patient, and the marriage as ceremonial. They repeated that the union would not be consummated until she reached maturity, a promise that sounded noble only if you forgot that she was a political hostage first and a human being second. Behind the tapestries and rehearsed smiles was a simple truth. The marriage was less about the future and more about optics. Richard, who had faced rebellion, assassination plots, and internal fracturing among his nobility, was trying to look like a man in control. A king not just capable of ruling, but of choosing peace. And then he lost everything. In 1399, just 3 years after the wedding, Richard was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned. Isabella, still only 9 years old, was now a queen in name, only a girl without a husband, country, or title. The new regime tried to clean things up. Henry IV offered to marry Isabella to his son, the future Henry V. This would tie the two houses together, soothe the political mess, and avoid the awkward implication that England had just sent a child bride back to France in disgrace. But France said no, emphatically. Isabella returned to her homeland in 1401. What followed was a quieter chapter 1 that unfolded away from the English throne, but no less shaped by it. In 1406, she married Charles, Duke of Orleans, a man closer to her in age, and someone she reportedly chose with more agency than she'd ever been afforded before. The marriage seemed happy, or at least untroubled. She died in 1409, just 19 years old, after complications from childbirth. Her daughter lived. History moved on. And here's where the story becomes harder to tell because there is no dramatic climax, no rebellion, no great betrayal, just a pattern. A girl offered to a man twice her age. A promise of peace built on borrowed time. A royal marriage so symbolic it swallowed the people inside it. Revisiting the story of Richard and Isabella isn't about retelling it. It's about recognizing that it was never told properly to begin with. Because when monarchies repeat the same structural violence under the guise of ceremony, they don't just reshape politics, they erase people. They turn children into symbols, treat women like treaties, and call it continuity. Isabella's portrait still hangs in some historical galleries, a child in heavy robes, her expression unreadable, her story archived not under tragedy, but diplomacy. But when you revisit that image, what you see is not just a queen. You see a placeholder, a delay, a girl written into a script she didn't audition for. And the unsettling part? She wouldn't be the last. Because the next bride on this list would also be remembered not for her voice, but for her timing, caught in the long shadow of empire, married into a world that valued noble lineage more than individual fate, and forever marked by the quiet question, what happens to a dynasty when the girl it rests on isn't old enough to say no? Theodora of Saxe-Meiningen and Prince Heinrich XXX Reuss of Köstritz. In the ever-expanding footnotes of European nobility, some names hover just outside the spotlight, too minor to headline, too entangled in dynastic threads to ignore. Theodora of Saxe-Meiningen and Prince Heinrich XXX Reuss of Köstritz were never household names. But their marriage, quietly staged in the late 19th century, represents the quiet persistence of a tradition few monarchies ever fully abandoned. Marrying young women to older men in the hope that time and titles might somehow cooperate. Theodora was born in 1890 into the House of Saxe-Meiningen, a small but respectable German duchy. Her lineage was steeped in conservative royal values, discipline, discretion, and dynastic loyalty. These were not the firebrand royals of revolutions and manifestos. These were the quiet ones. The ones who smiled politely, bowed correctly, and married according to the charts. Prince Heinrich XXX Reuss of Köstritz, yes, 30 was from the House of Reuss, a family so devoted to tradition that they named every male heir Heinrich and then numbered them chronologically, restarting the count every century. If that sounds like an Excel spreadsheet of cousins, it's because it kind of was. Heinrich XXX was about 15 years older than Theodora. That's not extreme by royal standards, but it becomes more noticeable when you consider the context. Theodora was just out of adolescence, barely stepping into adulthood, and Heinrich was already a seasoned nobleman with a political resume, military experience, and the full weight of minor princely responsibility on his shoulders. Their marriage, contracted in 1910, was more alliance than romance. The German Empire was still intact, though cracks were beginning to show. These small princely houses, Köstritz, Meiningen, and their cousins, were struggling to maintain relevance in an age of growing republicanism and industrial transformation. Marriage remained their most enduring tool, a way to bind families, preserve names, and shore up influence across regional courts. Theodora, by all accounts, was gentle, well-educated, and refined. She embodied the kind of princesshood that fit nicely into oil paintings and genealogical tables. Her marriage to Heinrich XXX offered no immediate political shockwaves, but it strengthened ties between houses whose prestige was increasingly ceremonial. But behind the quiet pageantry of the wedding was a familiar dynamic, a young woman entering a world shaped entirely by the generations before her. Theodora wasn't just marrying a man, she was marrying a system. She would be expected to represent stability, grace, and above all, fertility. The Reuss family needed heirs not just for succession, but for presence. Nobility, after all, was becoming more symbolic with every passing decade. Without children, a family name could dissolve into footnotes. With them, it could at least continue to appear in seating charts. Theodora delivered. She gave birth to children, managed estates, and performed ceremonial duties with the kind of practiced restraint that often passes for contentment in royal records. There are no tabloid scandals, no fiery letters, no court rebellions, just the slow unfolding of a dynastic life, public, deliberate, and almost entirely unexamined by the broader world. And that's precisely what makes her story so telling. Because not every royal marriage ends in execution, abdication, or dramatic exile. Some of them persist quietly. Some of them are deeply unequal, not in affection or cruelty, but in structure. 15 years is not, on its own, a horror story. But when paired with duty, pressure, and the unspoken expectation that a young woman's life is to be folded seamlessly into an older man's legacy, the imbalance becomes harder to ignore, especially when the surrounding world begins to change. By the early 20th century, monarchy was no longer immune to consequence. World War I erupted in 1914, and the entire continent began to tear itself apart. The German Empire collapsed by 1918, and with it, the formal titles of hundreds of minor nobles. Theodora and Heinrich, like so many aristocrats of the era, became relics in real time, stripped of legal power, but still cloaked in social performance. They were no longer ruling anything. They were simply playing the roles assigned to them by birth and marriage. Prince Heinrich XXX died in 1939, just as Europe braced for yet another war. Theodora lived until 1972, long enough to see the monarchy erased from most of the continent, and the world that once demanded her obedience quietly disappear. And in the end, hers is not a tragic story. It is a quiet one. A study in how institutions sustain themselves not with fire and blood, but with repetition, with young brides, with polite silences, with marriages that look fine on paper and feel inevitable. Theodora's life was not about upheaval. It was about endurance. But that endurance came at a cost, one that many royal women paid without ever being asked if they agreed to the terms. And while her story might seem like the end of an era, it isn't. Because dynastic math has a long memory, and history has a way of circling back. Which takes us next to Portugal, where a queen married her own uncle, the king, and the throne became a family affair in the most literal and legally confusing way possible. Maria, I of Portugal, and Infante Pedro, her uncle. In the 18th century, European monarchies were beginning to feel the tremors of change. Enlightenment ideals were spreading. Revolutions were simmering. But within many courts, the marriage contracts continued exactly as they always had, with ink, blood, and a complete disregard for modern sensibilities. Maria, I of Portugal, was born into one of the oldest ruling houses in Europe. She was intelligent, deeply religious, and raised with a clear understanding of what her future would require. As the eldest surviving child of King Jose I, she was, by law and by lineage, the heir presumptive to the Portuguese throne. She would become queen. That was never in question. What was in question, uncomfortably so, was who she would marry. The answer came from within the family. Literally. In 1760, at the age of 25, Maria married Infante Pedro of Braganza, her paternal uncle. He was her father's younger brother, 20 years older than she was, and already a seasoned statesman within the Portuguese court. Pedro was 45, experienced, politically adept, and fully immersed in the dynastic machinery that kept the House of Braganza spinning. By most standards, moral, cultural, or emotional, it was a deeply uncomfortable arrangement, but in royal terms, it made perfect sense. Keeping bloodlines pure had been the obsession of European royalty for centuries. Marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins, and even siblings were not unprecedented. They were seen as strategic. Marrying within the house preserved dynastic claims, kept foreign influence at bay, and simplified the already tortuous family trees scribbled in court archives. Maria and Pedro's marriage was presented as stabilizing. It unified two branches of the same royal bloodline. It eliminated outside claims. It consolidated legitimacy. It also, quietly, erased the idea that either of them had a choice. Maria was reportedly devout and dutiful. Pedro was formal, reserved, and fiercely loyal to the Braganza dynasty. Their marriage, on the surface, was functional. They produced 6 children, including the future king João VI. In dynastic terms, it was a success. Heirs were born, lines were secured, the throne was kept within the family. But beneath that polished surface, the story of Maria and Pedro is far more complex and more unsettling. Because what happens when you marry a person you were raised to call uncle? What kind of relationship can grow in the space between tradition and taboo? The historical record is largely silent on their personal dynamics. There are no surviving love letters, no gossip-riddled memoirs, no grand gestures of romance. What we have are official documents, court records, and the careful choreography of 2 people performing a role they never got to rewrite. Maria ascended to the throne in 1777, becoming the first undisputed queen regnant of Portugal. Pedro, already styled as her consort, became king jure uxoris king in right of his wife. But his kingship was ceremonial, not sovereign. Maria ruled. And she ruled well, at least at first. Her early reign was marked by intelligence and reform. She repealed many of her father's oppressive laws, promoted education, and earned the respect of her people. She was called Maria the Pious, not as mockery but as genuine recognition of her devotion both to her faith and her country. But tragedy began to accumulate like a slow tide. Her husband and uncle, Pedro, died in 1786. Then her eldest son João's wife died in childbirth. Then João's infant daughter died. Then her confessor. Then her mother. The series of personal losses stacked so closely together had a profound effect on Maria. By 1792, she began to show signs of severe mental decline. Some historians have diagnosed her, retroactively, with clinical depression or religious psychosis. Others simply call it madness, in the cold language of the time. Her cries could reportedly be heard throughout the palace. She believed she was damned. She believed she had committed sins that could not be absolved. She never recovered. By 1799, her son João officially took over the government as Prince Regent. Maria remained queen in name, but not in function. Her condition deteriorated until her death in 1816, during exile in Brazil, Portugal, having fled the Napoleonic invasions across the Atlantic. What remains of her marriage is a dynasty preserved and a woman erased. There are no great romantic tributes, no wistful court poets, just a legal union between a niece and an uncle, designed to maintain control over a kingdom that, like its queen, was slowly unraveling beneath the weight of history. Pedro may have loved Maria, or perhaps he simply respected her duty, or perhaps he saw in her the same inevitability that governed his own life. What we do know is that their union was neither scandalized nor celebrated, it was merely expected. And sometimes, that's the darkest part of all. Because when something unsettling is treated as normal, it doesn't fade from history, it fades into it. And as the royal houses of Europe continued their centuries-long game of genetic Jenga, more than one kingdom would come to regret how tightly it had tried to keep its bloodlines in place. Which takes us next into a tangled web of medieval marriage politics, where English kings and foreign-born brides became the currency of war, peace, and temporary illusions of control. Other medieval and early modern arranged royal marriages. History has a convenient way of filing entire categories of uncomfortable reality under the heading of tradition, and perhaps nowhere is that more apparent than in the dizzying array of arranged royal marriages across medieval and early modern Europe, where the exchange of young brides for old kings, barely-of-age girls for battle-hardened monarchs, and children for treaties wasn't the exception, but the operating system. This wasn't about romance. It was barely about diplomacy. It was about lineage. About alliances inked in adolescence, borders stabilized by betrothal, and sovereign power passed down like a family recipe with no room for refusal. Take, for instance, the marriage of Henry V of England and Catherine of Valois, a union wrapped in silk and strategy and built squarely on the scaffolding of conquest. Henry V was already a national hero by the time of his marriage in 1420. Fresh from his military triumph at Agincourt, he was 33, triumphant, and utterly certain of his divine right to claim not only the English crown, but the French one as well. The Treaty of Troyes gave him just that, a legal claim to France through marriage to the French king's daughter. Catherine of Valois was 17. She had barely stepped out of childhood when she was thrust into the center of one of Europe's longest and bloodiest conflicts. Her father, Charles VI of France, was descending into madness. Her kingdom was fractured. And so she was offered to the enemy, not as a betrayal, but as a bargain. One young bride in exchange for peace, legitimacy, and a thinly veiled occupation. Their wedding was both political theatre and realpolitik. Henry took Catherine back to England, where she was crowned queen. By all accounts, their relationship was civil, perhaps even affectionate, but short. Henry died just 2 years later, in 1422, of illness while campaigning in France. Catherine, widowed at 19, was left with an infant son, the future Henry VI. What followed was a royal script so familiar it bordered on parody. Catherine's role was immediately downgraded from queen to potential liability. Her youth, beauty, and widowhood made her dangerous. The court feared she might remarry worse, that she might marry below her station and produce rivals to the crown. And so a law was passed. The Dowager Queen could not marry without the consent of the King's Council. A council, it should be noted, that reported to the infant king. The restriction wasn't just about power, it was about ownership. Catherine had been transferred once already from France to England, and now she was to be preserved, displayed, but never given agency, which made her next move all the more subversive. She reportedly fell in love with Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier of modest status. They married in secret, perhaps unofficially, and had several children. Among them was Edmund Tudor, father of the future Henry VII. Catherine's quiet rebellion would go on to found the Tudor dynasty itself. But her original marriage, like so many others of her era, was never meant to be about rebellion. It was meant to be about sealing a treaty, producing an heir, dying quietly if necessary. She just didn't stick to the script. And Catherine was hardly alone in her experience. Margaret of Anjou, married to Henry VI at just 15, became queen to a king with a failing grip on power and, eventually, on reality. She was thrust into a civil war before she was legally old enough to make her own decisions. Her marriage, like so many others, was arranged not for love or partnership, but to neutralize a threat, only for it to create an entirely new one. Or consider Eleanor of Provence, who married Henry III of England around age 12. Her arrival in England marked the beginning of decades of foreign court tensions, political factionalism, and eventually rebellion. Not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented, a foreign queen placed like a chess piece into a game she did not design. In each of these cases, the women involved were young, the men were older, the marriages were contractual, and the consequences were usually borne not by the men who arranged them, but by the women who lived inside them. These were not isolated events. They were part of a culture of dynastic maintenance, one that viewed adolescence as a resource, obedience as virtue, and fertility as function. The same cycle repeated across centuries. In castles and cathedrals, in parlours and palaces, entreaties sealed with rings, and childhoods buried under crowns too heavy for their wearers. And if you think this pattern eventually disappeared, the next story will gently remind you otherwise. Because even in the age of jet planes and press photographers, the throne still remembers the old rules. And one of the most famous royal couples of the modern age, complete with flashbulbs, fairy tale gowns, and televised vows, was marked not just by love or tragedy, but by the same quiet arithmetic that defined every royal match before it. An older man, a younger bride, a monarchy with everything to gain and everything to lose. King Charles and Princess Diana. The story of Charles and Diana has been told so many times that it risks becoming background noise, another overexposed royal narrative smoothed down by too many Netflix reenactments and coffee table biographies. But strip away the glossy documentaries and the slow-motion wedding clips, and what remains is an unsettlingly familiar pattern. An older heir, a younger bride, and a crown, trying to script human beings into symbols. In 1981, Prince Charles was 32 years old. Lady Diana Spencer was 20. 12 years apart. Not a scandalous gap by historical standards, certainly not in the context of monarchies, but in hindsight, that space was cavernous. Not just in age, but in power, in experience, in intention. Charles had spent his entire life in the royal spotlight. He was the heir to the British throne, raised in palaces, educated at elite schools, weighed down with centuries of expectation. He had already had relationships, some public, most very private, and was, by the early 82nds, under pressure to marry, not just marry, but marry correctly, the right bloodline, the right religion, the right temperament, the right image. Diana, by contrast, had just exited adolescence. She was shy, sheltered, and most importantly, perfect for the role. Noble, young, photogenic, and uncontroversial. The press called her a fairy tale. The palace called her suitable. Charles, if anything, seemed vaguely hesitant. But it went ahead anyway. The engagement was announced, the ring was displayed, and then came that famously awkward moment in their televised interview when a reporter asked, "Are you in love?" Diana smiled and said, "Of course." Charles looked off into the distance and replied, "Whatever in love means." There it was, the arithmetic of the modern monarchy. The marriage was not just a personal arrangement, it was a national investment. The wedding, watched by 750 million people worldwide, became a pageant of reassurance. The heir is settled, the monarchy is stable, and the future is unfolding on schedule. But behind the curtains, the math was off. Diana entered the marriage with no real preparation for the emotional labyrinth of royal life. She was 20 years old, instantly the most photographed woman in the world, and bound to a man who was already emotionally tethered elsewhere. The age difference wasn't the problem, it was the imbalance of awareness. Charles had spent 3 decades under the palace microscope. Diana was still learning how to speak without trembling on camera. And then came the children. William in 1982, Harry in 1984. From the outside, it was perfect. The young princess, the photogenic family, the heir and the spare. But the illusion held only as long as the camera shutters clicked. Inside, the marriage was disintegrating quietly, then not so quietly. Affairs, interviews, isolation, tabloid feeding frenzies. Charles and Diana officially separated in 1992. They divorced in 1996. 1 year later, Diana was dead. And so the fairy tale collapsed into a footnote, and the footnote became a fable. But what it reveals is not just a tragic love story, it's a recurring blueprint. Take a young woman, pair her with an older royal, dress her up as stability, tell the world she's ready, watch her disappear. Diana, of course, didn't disappear. She refused to. Her post-divorce life, however short, was a defiant rewriting of her role. She became a global humanitarian figure, and in doing so, exposed the performative hollowness at the core of the modern monarchy. But it was too late to save the marriage, or the girl who had been handed a crown before she understood its weight. And if you think this was a uniquely British tragedy, think again. Because even among the sunlit balconies of Monaco, the pattern would repeat. An older prince, a younger bride, and a kingdom that still believed appearances could outlast reality. Prince Albert and Princess Charlene revisited. Yes, again. Because the story of Prince Albert II and Princess Charlene doesn't become less relevant with repetition, it becomes more revealing. We've already met them once. Albert, the 3-year-old lifelong bachelor. Charlene, the 3-year-old Olympian, thrust into royal life like a swimmer dropped into a frozen sea. The age gap, 20 years, wasn't the only distance between them. There was also culture, background, intention. But what warrants a second look isn't the tabloid drama. It's the persistence of a system that still insists this kind of match works. Even after a decade of marriage, Charlene's public appearances remained erratic. Her smile, when it appeared, rarely reached her eyes. In 2021, she spent months away from Monaco. Officially for medical reasons, but unofficially, the rumors surged again. Homesickness, unhappiness, isolation. The palace said she needed time to recover. The public wondered whether she was simply recovering from being a princess. Albert continued his public duties, calm as ever, while headlines flickered between worry and speculation. They eventually reunited. The twins Jacques and Gabriella became the new focus. The succession was secure, the facade held. But the emotional arithmetic of the marriage had already been written in full view. An older man, a younger woman, and a relationship that operated like a press release. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't tragic. It was just the latest version of the same old structure, wrapped in Mediterranean light. Monaco, like so many monarchies, clung to the appearance of continuity, and nothing says continuity quite like the image of a serene princess beside her stately husband, regardless of what's beneath the surface. And if you think modern royals might eventually rethink that blueprint, if you imagine that the next generation might avoid it entirely, allow me to point you back, again, to the Dutch throne, where a king in the 19th century married a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, and the pattern once again became prophecy. William III of the Netherlands and Emma of Waldeck and Pyrmont revisited. Yes, once more. Because this marriage remains one of the starkest examples of royal dynastic desperation meeting generational asymmetry. William III was 61, Emma was 20, a 41-year gap wrapped in velvet and sealed with a crown. We've seen the outline. William, a cranky, erratic monarch whose first marriage had failed to produce surviving male heirs. Emma, young, Bavarian, unthreatening, and precisely what the Dutch throne needed: a woman capable of bearing a child before the dynasty collapsed into irrelevance. And bear one she did, Wilhelmina, born in 1880, the miracle baby, the savior of the House of Orange. Emma played her role to perfection. She ruled as regent after William's death in 1890. She protected her daughter's position. She stabilized the monarchy. She won public affection. And yet, her story was always cast in reference to his. The age gap was not just biological, it was generational, ideological, psychological. Emma entered a life shaped entirely by William's past, his age, his grief, his anger, his expectations, and she in turn became the quiet correction to his unruly legacy. They called it a success. But when you look closely, what you see is a dynasty saved, not by love, not by power, but by a young woman's compliance with a structure she never designed. The structure persists, because the next royal marriage, it wasn't just politically strategic, it was biologically urgent. A 70-year-old king and a bride still in her teens. No romance, no illusions, just a final, desperate attempt to print a future before the king ran out of time. King Władysław and Sophia of Halshani revisited. Some stories circle back not because we've forgotten them, but because we haven't fully understood them. We began this entire series with Władysław II Jagiełło and Sophia of Halshani, a marriage so chronologically lopsided it almost felt like a metaphor for dynastic power itself. But returning to it now, mid-journey through centuries of royal unions, the pattern sharpens into something even starker. Władysław II, aged over 70 at the time of his marriage, was no romantic fool. He was not a lost king looking for affection in his twilight years. He was a tactician, a survivor, a man who had spent decades building a political empire and needed a final insurance policy in the form of a male heir. Sophia, 15, possibly younger, was not chosen for companionship. She was chosen because she was the right mixture of noble blood and political neutrality. In short, she could be controlled. The crown justified the match as necessary. That word again. Always necessary. But necessary for whom? Certainly not Sophia. She gave birth to 2 sons, both of whom survived, which was statistically impressive given the time and medically miraculous given the circumstances. Her firstborn, Władysław III, would become king but not a stabilizing force. In fact, his reign would end in the mud and confusion of the Battle of Varna, where he died young, leaving no heir and returning the dynasty to its cycle of anxiety. Sophia, meanwhile, outlived her husband by over 30 years, and it's in that postmarital phase that we see something more than just a royal womb. As Queen Dowager, she wielded considerable influence. She advocated for her sons' rights, managed estates, and ensured that her children weren't sidelined by rival branches of the royal family. In many ways, she became more politically potent after Władysław's death, when she was no longer under the explicit command of an ancient husband or treated solely as a reproductive instrument. But her legacy, despite these contributions, still circles around that one uncomfortable image. A teenage girl married to a septuagenarian monarch whose first 3 wives had all failed to deliver the one thing he truly wanted: a lasting bloodline. In modern terms, the union reads like a case study in institutional control. A young woman, raised and trained to perform a national function, her personal experience irrelevant, her inner life undocumented. Her marriage recast as a national miracle the moment a child was born. And yet, when you follow the thread from Władysław to his sons to his grandsons, what you find is not a straight line of dynastic success, but a jagged timeline of instability, contested claims, and short-lived reigns. The very problem the marriage was supposed to fix, succession, remained broken. What it did preserve was the illusion of continuity, the performance of control, the theatre of inheritance. So why revisit it? Because the more examples we see, the more clearly we understand that these marriages were not isolated decisions. They were systemic design. And the system didn't just permit them, it required them. A king past his prime, a bride barely out of girlhood, a kingdom desperate to keep the crown above water, no matter the cost. And just when you think the pattern couldn't get any more transparent, it crosses borders to France again, where another king nearing the end of his life reached for a young English bride, not out of affection, but as a final gesture of strategy. Louis XII and Mary Tudor revisited. Once again, we find ourselves at the altar of political convenience. Louis XII of France was 52 years old. Mary Tudor, sister of the newly crowned Henry VIII, was just 18. That's a 34-year age gap neatly nestled within the royal tradition of sending teenage girls to foreign courts and calling it diplomacy. Louis had already been married twice. His second wife, Anne of Brittany, had been a formidable political operator in her own right. But with her death, Brittany, the once independent duchy, was permanently absorbed into the French crown. Strategically, Louis had won. Personally, he was alone. Politically, he was not done. The French court needed stability. Louis needed a new wife. And England, still flexing its early Tudor muscles, was eager to play the continental power game. Henry VIII, just 2 years into his reign, offered his youngest sister. It was a textbook move: forge an alliance, avoid a war, and make your sibling someone else's problem. Mary Tudor was known for her beauty, wit, and unshakable loyalty to her family. She was also known for being in love with Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, a courtier of lower rank but deep connection to her heart. She begged not to be sent to France. She lost. The wedding was rushed, as if the French court sensed the fragility of their king. Mary arrived with a glittering entourage, married Louis in October 1514, and was Queen of France for exactly 82 days. Louis died on January 1st, 1515. The official cause was illness. The unofficial rumour was that the 52-year-old king had been trying a bit too hard to keep up with his 8-year-old bride. The French courtiers joked. The English dignitaries smiled. Mary went into mourning as required, and then she did something rare. She took back her life. Within weeks, Mary secretly married Charles Brandon, the man she'd loved all along, without her brother's permission. Henry VIII was furious. He threatened them both, and then, in classic Tudor fashion, forgave them in exchange for money, loyalty, and public humility. It was a scandal that ended in domesticity. Mary and Charles lived quietly, by Tudor standards. They had children. They avoided major political disasters. Mary faded into the backdrop of Henry's increasingly chaotic reign. She died in 1533, just as her brother's marriage to Anne Boleyn was about to plunge the country into religious and dynastic crisis. But her story, like Sophia's, like Emma's, like Charlene's, remains defined by a single question. What does it mean to be married to a man twice your age when your body is considered a national asset? Because across centuries, courts, and continents, the answer seems to be the same. It means obedience, appearances, and silence. Until, of course, it doesn't. Because the next case isn't a metaphor or a callback, it's the exact same marriage again, listed once more, as if even history itself couldn't stop replaying the contradiction. Edward I's second marriage, revisited. By the time Edward I married Margaret of France, the man was more legend than life. He was England's Hammer of the Scots, crusader, legislator, king of meticulous conquest, and even more meticulous tax collection. His first wife, Eleanor of Castile, had died in 1290 after a marriage that, by all accounts, had been unusually affectionate. The pair had spent decades together. She had followed him on campaigns, borne 16 children, and been honoured with no fewer than 12 monumental crosses after her death. Edward mourned her publicly, sincerely, and then, 9 years later, married again. This time, the motive was not affection, it was politics, and the bride was not a fellow veteran of court life, but a 20-year-old French princess. Margaret of France was the half-sister of Philip IV, the King of France. Her marriage to Edward I was negotiated as part of a fragile truce between England and France in 1299. The 100 Years' War hadn't technically started yet, but the climate was already heavily armed and diplomatically exhausted. A union between the two houses was supposed to be the balm. Edward, at the time of their wedding, was about 60, possibly older. That makes the age gap roughly 40 years. It wasn't unusual, of course. By this point in our journey, it almost feels banal. The older king, the teenage bride, the marriage designed more to patch treaties than to forge love. But what makes this particular case so eerily emblematic is that it wasn't a one-time exception, it was Edward's second try at dynastic reinforcement. He had already had multiple sons with Eleanor, but most had died or were politically entangled. His heir, Edward of Caernarfon, the future Edward II, was widely seen as not ideal. Sensitive, unmilitary, more interested in court favourites than campaigns. Edward I, ever the iron-willed patriarch, wanted a second line of heirs, just in case. So he married Margaret. And Margaret, for her part, performed the role with grace, dignity, and a kind of resigned diplomacy that has echoed through the centuries. She bore him 3 children, Thomas, Edmund, and Eleanor. 2 sons and a daughter, delivered into a royal family where the father was old enough to have been their grandfather, indeed, old enough to have already fought multiple wars before they were even conceived. The English court, ever practical, adjusted its ceremonies accordingly. Margaret was treated with respect, but not intimacy. She was never a partner in policy, never a co-ruler. She was a royal instrument, important, visible, but not particularly empowered. Her role was reproductive and ceremonial, and she fulfilled both admirably. Edward died in 1307. Margaret was left a dowager queen at around 27 years old. She never remarried. Why would she? In widowhood, she gained more freedom than she ever had as a bride. She raised her sons with care, maneuvered court politics with quiet precision, and lived long enough to see the crown pass into the hands of her stepson Edward II, and eventually to her own son Thomas, Earl of Norfolk. In a strange way, her marriage had succeeded. She had preserved the royal bloodline. She had given England a spare set of heirs, and she had done it without scandal or complaint. And yet, her legacy remains shadowed by silence. No scandal, no rebellion, no drama. Just the quiet arithmetic of monarchy. An old king, a young bride, a temporary alliance, and a lineage temporarily stabilized. Until, of course, it wasn't. Because if there's one thing we've learned by now, it's that royal marriages are only ever as stable as the politics they were designed to soothe. And just as Europe started looking westward and downward for new powers to rise, the structure of these marriages didn't dissolve, they spread. Which takes us, next, into the unnamed clusters, the royal gaps that don't come with portraits or parades, but with whispers across generations. The kind that weren't immortalized in tapestries, but still followed the same logic. Other examples of kings much older wed to young princesses. There are stories that history records in marble, and others it scribbles into the margins. This next group falls into the latter category, not one marriage, but a type, a structure, a repeated arrangement so common that it barely warranted individual attention in the annals of power, but together forms a grim chorus. Across medieval and early modern Europe, the formula was always the same. A king in his 50s or 60s or older found himself widowed or heirless. The court panicked, the advisors gathered, and a solution was reached. Find a young princess, quickly, secure a marriage, produce an heir, reassure the kingdom. The names blur together. A Hungarian monarch marrying a teenage Habsburg niece, a Moldavian voivode sealing a peace with a marriage to a barely adolescent Lithuanian duchess. A Danish king, aging and infirm, marrying a young German countess more notable for her dowry than her personality. Most of these unions produced heirs, many did not, but all of them followed the same script. The bride is young, often in her early teens, sometimes younger, always described as beautiful, obedient, and well-mannered, which, in this context, usually meant silent. The groom is powerful, older, militarily tested, politically significant, often recently widowed. His need to remarry is rarely questioned. The marriage is urgent. It exists not for companionship, but for continuity. The crown must not be left to chance. The line must continue. And in these margins, you begin to see the ghost of a system that didn't die with the Enlightenment, it simply became less visible. The women involved in these matches are often unnamed, their stories lost to treaties, their voices buried beneath lineage charts. We know them only by their offspring, if any, or their tombs if marked, or the rare mention by a diplomat who attended the wedding and commented on how pale the bride looked. But they existed, and they mattered. Even if history doesn't always remember their names, this wasn't love, it wasn't partnership, it was logistics. These were marriages as blueprints. Girls handed over not for who they were, but for what they could carry. And what they could carry, always, was legacy. That's what makes this unnamed category so telling, because it shows that the age gap wasn't the exception. It was the system. A system where the king's aging body could be compensated for by a bride's youth, where power didn't just tolerate the imbalance, it demanded it. And so, even as revolutions brewed and monarchies began to weaken, this ritual repeated itself in the corners of kingdoms far from the spotlight, but always close to the throne. And if you think those corners disappeared in modern times, you haven't looked east. Because the next royal empire, one that once stretched across 3 continents, took this blueprint and scaled it to imperial proportions, where marriage was no longer just a tool of policy, but the lifeblood of a sprawling sultanate. Various Ottoman sultans. The Ottoman Empire didn't invent the practice of older rulers marrying younger brides, but they institutionalized it with a kind of ruthless elegance. The harem, the iconic, over-mythologized, and deeply misunderstood institution of the imperial court, wasn't just a space of opulence and seclusion. It was a political machine, a dynastic engine, and within it, the age gap was more than tradition, it was law. Ottoman sultans typically married late, if at all. The early sultans, especially during the height of imperial expansion, rarely took official wives. Most of their partners were concubines, women of enslaved origin, often taken as part of the Devshirme or brought in from the Caucasus or Eastern Europe. These women weren't always married in the Western sense. They bore sons, were raised to powerful positions in the harem hierarchy, and could rise to extraordinary influence. But the relationships were often carefully constructed to avoid the kind of dynastic chaos that had plagued European courts, and yet age dynamics were unmistakable. The sultans, often well into their 42nds or 52nds by the time they chose a formal consort or focused on dynastic succession, inevitably selected partners decades younger. In some cases, the gap was 30 years. In others, 40. In a few, even more. And unlike European courts where the union would be solemnized with fanfare, in the Ottoman context, it often occurred behind closed doors, announced only when a pregnancy or a birth elevated a woman to the status of Haseki, favorite consort, or valid sultan, queen mother. One of the clearest examples of this dynamic was Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and Hurrem Sultan Roxelana. Though their ages were relatively close, perhaps only a 10 to 15-year gap, the structure they embodied set the template for the empire's future. The powerful ruler, choosing his consort from a sea of youth, beauty, and obedience. Later, sultans would stretch the age difference further, marrying or elevating girls who were barely teenagers, while they themselves were grizzled veterans of the Janissary Corps or the battlefield. Sultan Abdulmajid I, for instance, was in his early 32nds when he began taking younger consorts, some as young as 15 or 16. His son, Sultan Abdulaziz, followed a similar pattern. By the late 19th century, these age gaps had become quietly normalized, an almost mechanical aspect of imperial continuity. But here's the twist. These young women, especially those who bore sons, could eventually outrank everyone. Once their sons ascended the throne, they became valid sultans, often ruling the court with extraordinary power. In fact, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire experienced what historians call the Sultanate of Women, a period where the mothers of sultans effectively ran the empire, managing court politics, foreign relations, and even military campaigns. It's a sharp irony. Women who entered the court as powerless teenagers, married to men twice or three times their age, ended up becoming some of the most powerful figures in Islamic imperial history. But their influence didn't erase the structural imbalance that brought them there. They didn't rise because they were wives, they rose because they were mothers. Their bodies had been used to birth continuity, and only after proving their worth through dynastic survival did they gain access to real authority. And yet, despite this occasional empowerment, the overall system remained unchanged. The age gaps persisted. The young girls continued to arrive. The sultans continued to choose and discard as they pleased. The machine kept turning. Unlike in European courts, where such marriages were often publicly debated, in the Ottoman context, the silence was strategic. The empire didn't need approval, it needed results. And so, the system endured, quietly, efficiently, unquestioned, until of course the empire itself began to crumble. And as the Ottoman influence receded, another empire with its own age gap marriages and dynastic obsessions rose in the east. A Persian dynasty with velvet thrones, iron rules, and royal weddings that blurred the line between family obligation and hereditary loop. Kajar dynasty of Persia divided by Iran. In the glittering, oil-slicked mirror of Kajar Persia, power and aesthetics were deeply intertwined. It was an empire obsessed with continuity, image, and the delicate performance of royalty. And like its European and Ottoman counterparts, the Kajar court knew precisely how to balance its aging rulers with very, very young brides. The Kajar dynasty, which ruled Persia from the late 18th century into the early 20th, was built on bloodlines. These weren't just family connections, they were policy. The Shahs married strategically, often choosing girls from rival noble families to secure alliances, legitimize claims, and forestall rebellion. And because the pool of noble families was limited, the age difference between bride and groom tended to expand exponentially with each generation. The Shahs aged, their brides somehow did not. Nasr al-Din Shah Kajar, one of the most famous rulers of the dynasty, reigned for nearly 50 years from 1848 to 1896. He was charismatic, artistically inclined, and obsessed with photography. He commissioned thousands of images of his harem, carefully documenting his court not through text, but through image. Many of those images feature girls some barely into adolescence dressed in heavy silks, staring solemnly into the camera. They were his consorts, concubines, and in some cases, wives. The age gap in these unions was not merely a byproduct of royalty, it was a feature. The Shahs chose younger brides to reinforce their virility, their authority, and their continued dominance. In some cases, the Shah was old enough to be the grandfather or great-grandfather of the girl he married. The records often avoid exact numbers. They use euphemisms like a youthful bride of noble descent or daughter of a prominent Khan. But the subtext is clear. The Kajar court didn't just tolerate these marriages, it celebrated them. They were displays of control, endurance, and dynastic virility. Each young bride was a symbol of continuity, a reassurance that the crown, however tarnished by modernity or threatened by colonial pressure, still had youth on its side. But beneath the pageantry, the contradictions began to unravel. The very age gaps that were once signs of strength began to expose cracks in the dynasty's foundations. These young queens and princesses, often unprepared and unsupported, became passive symbols in a court that increasingly relied on nostalgia rather than relevance. By the end of the 19th century, the Kajar court had become the subject of satire, critique, and growing public disillusionment. The constitutional revolution of 1905-1911 signaled that the days of hereditary rule, let alone arranged age gap royal marriages, were numbered. Still, the imagery lingers. In museum archives, the photos remain. Black and white portraits of teenage brides seated beside aging shahs, both frozen in time, performing a version of stability that history would eventually reject. And yet, even after Persia stepped into the modern age, the pattern remained recognizable elsewhere, most visibly in yet another dynasty that used marriage to negotiate not just domestic alliances, but the very shape of an empire. Because if the Qajars perfected the aesthetics of the age gap marriage, the next dynasty, an empire of jade and silk, would turn it into a cosmic mandate. Mughal emperors. The Mughal Empire, at its peak, was a monument to ambition carved into the Indian subcontinent, opulent, expansionist, and deeply hierarchical. It was an empire ruled by men who believed themselves to be divinely ordained, descended from Timur on one side and Genghis Khan on the other. The Mughals built palaces so vast they required their own climates, court rituals so intricate they resembled religious liturgies, and dynastic traditions so deeply entrenched that even their personal relationships were political events. Naturally, marriage was part of that script. While the Mughals rarely formalized their unions in the same way as their European counterparts, favoring a complex system of wives, concubines, and royal women known as begums, the pattern of age gap relationships remained entirely intact. In fact, it thrived under a different name: dynastic consolidation. Mughal emperors were often much older than their chosen brides. This was not accidental nor incidental. It was strategic. These unions allowed the emperors to forge alliances with powerful Rajput kingdoms, reward loyalty among Persian or Central Asian nobles, or reassert control over rebellious territories. And the younger the bride, the more malleable the arrangement was perceived to be. Take Akbar the Great, arguably the most famous of the Mughals. He married multiple Rajput princesses, including Jodha Bai, though historians debate her name, status, and even existence. What's less contested is that these princesses were often in their early teens, while Akbar was already well into adulthood. These marriages were less about affection and more about absorbing entire regions into the imperial fold without lifting a sword. But Akbar was hardly alone. Shah Jahan, builder of the Taj Mahal, married Arjuman Banu Begum, later known as Mumtaz Mahal, when he was around 15 and she 14. While their union was one of the rare love stories in the annals of empire, many of Shah Jahan's other marriages, especially later in life, followed the same established pattern. Older emperor, younger consort, political consolidation masquerading as romance. Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughals, known more for his orthodoxy than his sentiment, maintained this tradition. His multiple marriages and vast harem followed precedent, with consorts often decades younger, plucked from noble households to guarantee loyalty or prevent rebellion. What's particularly haunting about the Mughal marital structure is how little voice the women had, not just in choosing their husbands, but in shaping their own legacies. Most of these young brides disappear into the footnotes of history, named once in a wedding record or genealogical scroll, then lost forever. Even the mothers of emperors, arguably the most powerful women in the system, are often remembered only by the sons they produced. The harem system itself was a sealed world, governed by hierarchy and surveillance. And yet, some of these women, despite the constraints, managed to wield influence. Nur Jahan, wife of Emperor Jahangir, effectively ruled in his stead for years, signing decrees, issuing coins in her name, and commanding imperial troops. But her power was the exception, not the rule. The rule was simple: young brides, older rulers, strategic marriages, silent sacrifices. It's tempting to view this through a purely historical lens, to excuse it as a relic of a different time. But when the system is so consistent, so widespread, and so essential to imperial governance, it becomes impossible to separate the politics from the people. These weren't simply age gap relationships. They were imperial policies, executed through the bodies and lives of teenage girls handed over like diplomatic offerings. And while the Mughal court no longer casts its long shadow over the Indian subcontinent, the echoes of its marriage politics can still be heard if you know where to listen. Because the next empire on our list didn't just inherit the structure, it scaled it, formalized it, and recorded every age difference in its ledgers, not as a moral question, but as an administrative detail. Chinese imperial marriages. There's something uniquely paradoxical about the imperial court of ancient China. It was a system that revered age, wisdom, and Confucian hierarchy, and yet, when it came to marriage, emperors repeatedly reached downward on the age scale, selecting consorts so young that entire reigns began before their brides had lost their milk teeth. In the vast dynastic machinery of China, marriage was less a private arrangement than a cosmic alignment. The emperor was the son of heaven, and his unions were meant to mirror celestial harmony. In practice, that harmony often looked like a middle-aged ruler taking a teenage or preteen bride selected from across the empire. The selection process was formal, even ritualized. During certain dynasties, eligible young girls from noble or wealthy families would be summoned to the palace and inspected for imperial suitability. This wasn't just about beauty. Officials assessed family loyalty, political usefulness, and even signs of auspicious fate. Once selected, these girls would be assigned ranks concubine, consort, empress, depending on the emperor's preferences and political needs. But whatever title they received, the age gap was almost always significant. During the Ming and Qing dynasties in particular, emperors routinely selected consorts under the age of 15. The emperors themselves were often decades older, particularly those marrying later in life to consolidate power or produce an heir after earlier misfortunes. In some cases, emperors well into their 60s married girls not yet in their teens. These weren't anomalies, they were systemic procedures. Take the Qianlong Emperor, who ruled from 1735 to 1796 and lived into his late 82nd. He took multiple young consorts throughout his life, especially after the death of his beloved Empress Xiao Xianqun. These new brides, often decades younger, were rarely mentioned in imperial histories unless they bore a son or fell into disgrace. Or the Guangxu Emperor, who came to the throne as a child and was later forced into a politically arranged marriage orchestrated by Empress Dowager Cixi. His empress, Longyu, was close in age, but his harem included several young girls selected from noble Manchu families, some so young that palace attendants had to raise them alongside the emperor. The selection of young brides wasn't merely traditional, it was a form of imperial insurance. Young girls could be molded, trained, and, perhaps most importantly, controlled. Their loyalty could be engineered through isolation, their identity overwritten with ceremonial roles. But the paradox went deeper. Confucian ideals valued filial piety, respect for age, and moral virtue. And yet, these very same ideals underwrote a system where youth was harvested for the continuation of imperial bloodlines. The emperor was expected to be both father and husband, ruler and god, and in this dizzying combination of roles, the humanity of the young consorts was often lost. Even when elevated to the title of empress, many of these women lived lives of ceremonial confinement trapped behind lacquered screens, responsible for nothing less than the cosmic balance of the state, and always under scrutiny. In the rare cases where these women found influence, it came through palace intrigue or maternal clout, but most remained invisible, their lives unrecorded, their feelings undocumented. And still, the age gap remained as predictable as the sunrise, not because it was necessary, but because it had been normalized. In this world of silk scrolls, jade seals, and bone-deep ritual, the emperor's youth was optional, his bride's youth was not. And as the dynasties rose and fell, the imperial marriage remained eerily consistent. One man, many women, and a power dynamic so severe it barely left room for names. Which brings us to our final stop, not in a palace, but across a continent, where kings ruled from hilltops, deserts, and savannas, where the age gap was less often written down, but no less embedded, and where history's silence doesn't mean absence, it just means we're the ones who stopped listening. African monarchies, historically. In the Western imagination, African monarchies are often relegated to myth and shorthand, reduced to a mix of folklore, warlord legend, and misremembered colonial narratives. But across the continent's sprawling cultural landscapes, royal institutions have existed for centuries, many far older than their European counterparts. From the Zulu kingdom of southern Africa to the Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, these monarchies had their own codes, customs, and yes, their own versions of the dynastic age gap marriage. The difficulty lies not in whether these unions occurred because they did, repeatedly, but in how history remembers them. Unlike Europe, where royal unions were chronicled with obsessive precision, or Asia, where palace records kept a tight grip on imperial memory, many African kingdoms prioritized oral tradition. Royal lineages were passed down through griots and clan elders, not court scribes or parchment. As a result, much of what we know is layered with both fact and folklore. Still, patterns emerge. In many African kingdoms, kings were not expected to marry for romance, and they certainly weren't expected to marry only once. Polygamy was not a scandal, it was a political strategy. A king's wives were not merely spouses, they were emissaries, tokens of allegiance, and, in many cases, symbols of conquest or alliance. And the younger the bride, the more pure and politically malleable she was considered to be. Among the Zulu, for instance, royal polygamy was institutional. Shaka Zulu, the 19th century military strategist and king, never officially married, but his successors certainly did, and often chose brides from subjugated or allied clans. The age difference was typically stark. Kings were men of status and experience, often well into their 30s or 40s before solidifying their full royal households. Their brides, on the other hand, were frequently in their early teens, selected by age as much as by lineage. In these systems, marriage was a binding ritual of allegiance. It was not uncommon for smaller tribes to offer a daughter to a powerful king, not out of coercion, but as a sign of loyalty or protection. The daughter, often barely into adolescence, would become one of many wives in the royal enclosure, her status rising or falling based on her proximity to power, her fertility, and the fortunes of her own clan. Similar practices existed in Ethiopia, particularly under the long-reigning Solomonic dynasty, which traced its lineage back to the biblical union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Emperors such as Menelik II and Haile Selassie followed traditions in which royal unions were crafted for dynastic legitimacy. Though less openly polygamous than their western or southern neighbors, the Ethiopian court still operated under a principle of strategic marriage, frequently pairing mature emperors with teenage noblewomen to secure alliances with regional warlords or noble houses. In West Africa, the kingdoms of Mali, Songhai, and Benin maintained extensive royal courts where the age dynamics followed a familiar formula. Mansa Musa, the famously wealthy 14th century emperor of Mali, is said to have had dozens of wives and concubines, many of whom were gifted to him from subordinate tribes. These women were chosen young, both as a sign of subservience and as a strategic promise of loyalty. It's worth noting too that in several African societies the concept of a queen mother held more political power than the queen herself. In kingdoms like the Ashanti of Ghana, the queen mother was a revered figure, often the king's actual mother, or a senior woman in the royal lineage, responsible for advising, selecting successors, and maintaining spiritual balance. This created a curious paradox. A king could have many young wives, but it was often an older woman who wielded the real authority behind the scenes. Despite the differences in structure and terminology, the age gap dynamic remains clear. Across kingdoms and centuries, a repeated pattern played out. Older rulers consolidating their legacy through younger brides, with marriage functioning less as a personal bond and more as a transactional bridge between clans, regions, or political factions. And unlike their European or Asian counterparts, these unions were less often preserved in writing and more often distorted by the lens of colonial record-keeping. European explorers and administrators frequently exaggerated or misunderstood the rituals they observed, sometimes painting African monarchies as unusually exploitative or bizarre, despite the fact that their own monarchies had spent centuries doing the exact same thing in embroidered robes. The problem was never the practice itself, it was whose version got archived. What emerges then is a sobering symmetry. From the stone churches of Axum to the savannah palaces of Dahomey, from the drumline ceremonies of the Yoruba to the spear-sharp councils of the Zulu kraals, royal marriages echoed the same structure. consolidate power, ensure succession, preserve the illusion of divine rule. And as in all the other royal courts we've explored, age was not just a number, it was a hierarchy. A young bride was a clean slate, a symbol, a political gift, offered in silence, a future whose shape had already been decided. And so we end not with a modern conclusion, but with a global reflection. 30 marriages, 30 mismatches, 30 reminders that the architecture of royalty, no matter the continent, is built on appearances, performance, and legacy. Not love, rarely choice. Almost never equality. The crowns may have changed, the languages may differ, but the math never did. Power plus youth equals stability. At least, that was the idea. But history, cruel, poetic, and often darkly amused, always finds a way to subtract the illusion.